Today I have a compilation video featuring 50 DIY dupes that I've made over the last several years. Next up, I found this beautiful Bronx oak pedestal, but at $120, I can definitely make this one for cheaper. Here's our supplies for this one, a 1x11 wood scrap, and I found this giant beaded garland at a thrift store months ago. I've just been holding on to them and waiting for the right project. Today's the day! I'm going to attempt to make a wood circle out of this scrap wood square using my jigsaw. I have seen people do this before and they make it look so easy. I need to create a template using a rectangular scrap wood board. I end up swapping this one out for a thin Dollar Tree rectangle wood blank, but I do the same process to it. I just wanted something a little bit thinner. But you first need to take the blade out of your jigsaw to see where it will sit on the wood board and mark that with a pencil. Then I'm taking a roller to get a straight line all the way down the board where I marked it for the blade. Here's where I swapped it out for the thinner board. I need to drill a hole big enough for the blade to fit comfortably through it, so I made my hole about a 1/2 inch. I also added a couple of pilot holes at 10.5 and 11 inches. This ends up being too big. I forgot that you want your pilot hole to be half of the diameter, so later I changed this to 5 inches. But it all just depends on how big of a circle you want to make. 11 inches would have created a 22-inch circle. There are a few ways you can attach the jigsaw to the board. You could screw it on. I didn't have long enough screws for that, so I used this double-sided foam tape from the Dollar Tree. This stuff is super strong and worked perfect for this project. I added a strip down both sides of my jigsaw feet and then placed it onto the board. Now, my first attempt wasn't great. I'm leaving it in here to show you. I wasn't thinking about how I needed the saw to be on the opposite side of the board because I'm right-handed. The way I set it up was for a left-handed person, so I struggled to get the board I was cutting to spin while guiding the jigsaw with my left hand. The circle isn't completely terrible, but definitely could be better. So I flipped the jigsaw around on the board to make it right-handed. Then I measured out where my center point on the circle would be, screwed the board down to the center of my scrap wood, and then I cut out a new circle. This one turned out so much better. It's a little off where I began and ended, but that's okay. Next, I'm going to sand it all down and we can smooth that out. I also rounded all of the edges with my sander to make it a little bit less sharp looking by taking my sander and rolling it back and forth over the sides. By no means is this a perfect circle, but I think it looks pretty darn good. And you can always use a wood circle from the hardware store to make this same project. Next, I'm going to stain my wood in the color Early American. This color looks pretty close to the McGee & Co. inspiration piece. When the stain dried, I can add the bead legs on. As I was getting the beads out, I realized they're not all the same size, and in fact, no two were really the same size at all. I tried all of the beads and nothing was working. There was a constant wobble from some of them not touching the wood at all. So I used my flexible tape measure to measure all of the beads from center hole to center hole, and I used the 4 that were closest in size. I thought about cutting the tops off to make sure that they were all the same height, but I wasn't really sure what the best way was to do that. Anyways, once I got 4 beads and no wobble, I marked where I wanted them to sit on the circle, and I measured how far in from the edge that was. This way I can make sure that all 4 beads sit in the same spot. I had them about a half an inch in from the edge. Then I used wood glue to add them to the board, but I think E6000 would have also been a good choice because the beads are painted and not raw wood. They actually aren't wood at all. I tried sanding one of them to see, but they're MDF. Off camera, I did go back and add on a 5th beaded leg to make this look more like the inspiration, but that's it for this project. Would you ever attempt to cut out a wood circle yourself, or prefer to buy them pre-made at the hardware store? And this one is listed on my site. Next, recreating this Anthropologie Apothecary bud vase. Starting out with these Jot book rings that I got from the Dollar Tree. I needed 7 of them, which is why I had to buy 2 packages, but you will have 5 left over. Just like with the copper planter DIY, I'm going to be layering a few different colors of paint here, starting out with my black Waverly chalk paint. I'm also going to use my heat tool again to dry each layer of paint. The next color I will be using is Apple Barrel's Burnt Umber. I just love the red undertone of this color when you want to get that aged or rusted look. Next, I am taking this Tim Holtz Distress Oxide in the color Vintage Photo, and I'm going to spray it all over my book rings. I just love the way that this adds so much detail and dimension to a faux rust or an aged finish that you're going for. And once you add that heat tool to it, look at how the color changes and just really gives it that authentic look. After this, I did just go back and forth with my black and my burnt umber and the sprays until I was happy with how it turned out. Next, I'm going to start laying everything out. So I grabbed this scrap wood from my garage. Measurements are on the screen, along with these bud vases from Target. I'm sorry that is so out of frame, but they were $3 for 3 bud vases. And then I'm grabbing these 2 Dollar Tree clear bud vases as well. I need to figure out where my vases are going to sit so that I know how far or how long each dowel needs to be in between the rings. That is how the inspiration looked. I don't know exactly what they used. I think they probably used all metal, but this is the best I could come up with, and I think it worked out pretty well. So I'm just going to measure my dowel. I ended up cutting them down to be about 1.5 inches in between each book ring. And then I did glue them together with my E6000. I don't think I show it, but I also cut down 2 tiny pieces of the dowel that were 5/8 of an inch. Next, I have a slightly thicker dowel that I cut down to be 2 inches long. I have 2 of those, and I'm gluing a 10mm bead to the top of it that's about the same thickness. You want those holes to be facing the sides because we're going to stick the book ring through it. And then I just painted all of the dowels with that same process that we did the book rings. Now it's time to assemble, and I'm not going to lie, that book ring part is fragile, so be careful with this if you attempt to make this project, but I absolutely love the way it turned out. I did just hot glue those little side pieces and then used my super glue to attach that tiny dowel to the end book ring. In hindsight, I probably should have glued everything together before painting any of it, but it still worked out just fine. And here's a look at the Anthropologie version for $58, and mine only cost $8. Let me know what you think of this dupe. some leather scraps that I have. I got a remnant pack from Hobby Lobby for about $5, and I'm gonna cut it down into strips. You could definitely find leather ribbon or something at a craft store, but since I already had this on hand, I just wanted to use what I had and cut it down to the sizes I need. I just used my square and my cutting mat, just lined all the pieces up, made sure they were as symmetrical as I could get them, and then just cut them all down. Now that I have all of my strips, I'm gonna take them around this Dollar Tree vase and glue them on with my E6000, since hot glue is not going to stick to glass. So I start a little bit down from the top, right around like where the neck is, and it starts to bevel back out. And I'm gonna glue these all around at an egg or at a diagonal. You have a little bit of working time with E6000, so it will start to get tacky, but it will slide around there for the first couple of seconds. So I just kept pushing it down and moving it in place where I wanted it, and it was fine. I didn't have any issues. It is also really easy to clean E6000 up off of the glass, so even though it might be seeping out a little bit, you can just take a damp cloth and wipe it right off. Even if you don't get to it until after it dries, it's really easy to wipe right off. So once I did this whole first layer and let that dry overnight, then I'm gonna go in with the second layer and we're gonna go in the opposite direction. And this is gonna form like a diamond pattern all the way around the vessel. And here's what it's looking like with both layers on and dry. I didn't worry about those bottom parts until after everything was dry, and then just snip them right off. So next I'm going to take some more strips of the leather and I'm going to flip them around so the suede part is facing out. And I cut these ones slightly thinner than the ones we used around for the diamond pattern. And I'm just going to glue these all the way around, 3 on the top and 3 on the bottom to cover up those raw edges. And the last thing I'm going to do is paint the inside of it white. The inspiration was white, and at first I wasn't going to do this, but I do think it brings out the detail of the leather a little bit better. And I didn't go all the way to the top. I only went up to where the leather ended. So here's the inspiration from Anthropologie, which was $28, and mine was only $2. Here it is staged on my frame, so you can see how it would look on there as well. I love the way this turned out. I think it looks very modern or Scandinavian, boho. It could fit in with many different home decor styles.
Inspiration from Pinterest and was fascinated by this 3-dimensional art piece made out of lace. Unfortunately, all the lace options I have on hand are not as thick and stiff as the one that this person used. My lace also doesn't have as much of a pattern to it, but I still wanted to give it a shot and see how it works out. That way I can keep my eye out for a better lace option in the future. I'm using a 12 by 12 canvas for all of today's projects. I bought them in bulk from Michaels, and then I grabbed a piece of lace that I had on hand. This lace is super thin, which made me pretty nervous that this project was not going to turn out well. But as always, we're going to test it out anyways. I figured out the placement and where I wanted the pattern to lay, and then I grabbed a texture paste to apply on top. I'm not sure what was used in that tutorial, but I found these options in my local stores. One is by Ranger, the same company that makes Tim Holtz products, and the other is by Folk Art. The Ranger texture paste was a little bit more runny than I expected it to be. I thought it would be on the thicker side, and you can see the dimensional effects paste is much stiffer, so I decided to use this one. I grabbed a palette knife and started to spread the paste over top of the lace. I did this slow and gently so the lace didn't shift and stayed right where I placed it. I covered all the pattern areas first because I wasn't sure how far this jar of paste would go. I ended up using the full container on this canvas, and it was the perfect amount. Once the design was covered, I spread the paste over the rest of the lace areas. Then once I had the whole surface covered, I built up some of the areas to make sure it was all thick enough and evenly coated. When you're happy with the coverage of the paste, it's time to lift up the lace and find out if it's going to work out well or look like a hot mess. And to be honest, I had very low expectations for this one, but to my surprise, it turned out pretty well. Now I set it aside and let the paste dry overnight. I thought the paste would feel like joint compound does when you do a raised stencil, where it's a little hard and sandable, but the texture of the dried paste was more rubbery. It was very interesting and unlike anything I have worked with. I did try to sand it down a bit, but that didn't do anything. Now to paint the piece, I was trying to get a similar look to that inspiration video I showed at the beginning, but I didn't have a large flat sponge to use. So I used my little sponge dauber with the color Prairie Gray by DIY Paint. I offloaded the sponge so that there was hardly any paint on it and glided it over the surface of the texture paste. I did not love how this was looking. I felt like the areas where the lace was sheer with no pattern looked pretty sloppy. The paint was dark in some areas and light in others, so I decided to paint the entire surface in the Prairie Gray color. I used my pointed round brush to do this to make sure it got into all those nooks and crannies. I did try a little white wax on the raised areas and didn't like how that looked either. You could actually tell what the print was much better with it just a solid color. So that's it for this one. Project is oddly hard but easy. I recently found these large dowels at the Dollar Tree, and I've had this wood circle in my stash, also from the Dollar Tree. The dowels come in a pack of 2, and we need 3 for this project, although you could use 4 if you wanted. I was inspired by this modern plant stand, and this one has 4 legs. I just wanted to make mine with 3, but my version is also much smaller. I have this little white IKEA planter pot that fits perfectly on the circle, so I then found out how tall I wanted the dowel to be against the planter. It was difficult to figure out how to get the legs on. I knew I wanted to use wood glue so the bond would be strong, but it was not easy attaching a dowel to the edge of a circle. I fumbled around with it for quite a while and then got a clamp out to hold it in place. I had to let each leg dry in place before adding on the next. So when it was time to add the next leg on, I measured the circumference of the circle so I knew where to put the next 2 and they would be evenly spaced. Then I got out my mini level to make sure the plant stand is functional and I don't glue one of the legs on slightly higher than another. I
I also had the genius idea to add a dab of hot glue to hold it in place while I got the clamp on. Now, why didn't I think of that sooner? Who knows? Better late than never though, right? I did the same thing for the third leg, which was the easiest one to put on. Then, once the last leg was dried, I'm painting the whole thing with my bronze patina paint by Dixie Belle. I don't plan on adding the patina spray here to distress or age this piece. I just wanted that metal look that was similar to the Pottery Barn version. Now, this project I want to say is a Pinterest dupe, but it's actually an Etsy dupe. I just found it on Pinterest, and here's the inspo. It cost $34. I had all of these supplies on hand, so it didn't cost me anything to make. I started out creating the arch shape by using foam core board and an embroidery hoop for the top, and then my roller for the sides. The Etsy one is made entirely out of clay, but I didn't want to use that much clay for the background. When cutting foam core board, you want to make sure you have a sharp blade so it cuts cleanly. I also used my embroidery hoop as a guide, but if you don't get the edges smooth when cutting, you can also sand them down. Next, I drew the lines for where each color is going. I did recreate this exactly like the Pinterest Etsy one, but used different paint colors. The colors I used are Sandcastle and Mud Puddle by Dixie Belle and Truffle and White by Waverly. You don't need to make sure the lines where the two colors meet is perfect because that's going to be covered up. The second arch is painted a solid white. I also ended up swapping the top two browns, but looking back at the footage, I wish I would have left it. One other tip when painting foam core board, it wants to curl on you because of the moisture from the paint. So to correct this, you want to make sure you paint the back as well. While that dries, I need to create the clay parts. I'm using these colors by Craftsmart, which is the Michaels brand, and I'm creating the rainbow first. You can use an extruder, which is what I used, or you can roll out the clay by hand. I made 2 strands of each color for the rainbow. After the rainbow is done, I needed to make the little dangly bits that were at the bottom. I didn't have a cutter with the correct shape, but I do have a rainbow shaped cutter. So I just pushed that into the clay after rolling it out, but only pressed all the way down in the middle. And then flipped the cutter over so I could use the rounded part on both sides. And I created 6 of these pieces and then added a hole using my needle tool. For the second arch, I made 1 more long white snake and the dangly bits using a different clay color, and then popped all my clay pieces into the oven and baked them at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes, and then turned the oven off and let the clay cool down inside. When the clay was cool enough to work with, I used my Star Bond super glue to attach the rainbow to the white arch. Then to add a hole to the bottom of the arch for the dangly pieces, I used a crocodile, but a regular hole punch would work just as well. And I just laid out the pieces and eyeballed the spacing between them. To add the pieces on, I'm using jump rings. I have a variety pack of different colors and used the color that matched the clay the closest. I believe my jump rings are only about 7 millimeters, so I had to add 3 of them to each piece. 1 on the arch, 1 on the clay, and then 1 in the middle. That way the clay piece would face the right direction. For the second arch, I glued the clay snakes down where the paint colors meet and added the dangly pieces the same way. I forgot to create the moon with my first round of clay, so I had to go back in and add that, and the last thing I did was add a black chain to hang these on the wall.
This is a plant hanger from the Dollar Tree. I wish I had a different color chain, but we're working with what some leftover canvas parts that I have. I had ripped these off of some frames whenever I made a black window out of, what are those called? Canvas frames. I'll link that video for you guys up above and in the description box in case you haven't seen it. But I did keep the canvas parts because I knew I could use them for something else. And I'm just cutting them down to the size I want them to be. The only part I drew on here, I'm gonna make some like botanical eucalyptus art. And this is the only part I drew on with my pencil, was just the initial stem, so I knew where I wanted to start at, and everything else I just did freehand. I've never done something like this before. I have a lot of firsts in this video, but I really do love the way that they turned out. But the only color I am using is Moss by Waverly, and then I take some black and white to create like light and shadows, or highlights and shadows in it. But I start out just creating the stem, and I'm using the darker moss color with the black added to it. And then I also go in with a little bit of black while the paint is still wet, and just add it in there ever so slightly to give some dimension. My big head's gonna keep getting in the way here. Once I have my stem all created, then I add on like little branches coming off that are going to then hold my eucalyptus leaves, and I'm using really tiny detail brushes to do all of this. It was really fun and relaxing. If you don't think that you're very good at painting, I didn't think so either, and I really love the way this turned out. I wanted it to have a very like handmade look to it. And when I was looking for inspiration images, all I could really find were like prints, like reproduction, mass-produced prints, and not like true watercolor that someone had created. But I really thought these looked handmade anyways, like even the print ones, so I thought it would be pretty easy to recreate. Next, I'm just taking a slightly bigger detail brush, and I'm just creating like circles, ovals. I don't want them to be perfect because eucalyptus leaves are not perfect. They're kind of circular, kind of ovalish. And then I just filled that in. This is using just the regular moss, no black or white added to it yet. So once I have my shape and I fill that in, then I go back in with some white paint, again, while my color is still wet. And then I can just kind of blend them together. So you can see that first one that I did, how it has a little bit of white highlight at the top. So that's what I do. And I want to do this while it's wet so everything blends together seamlessly. And this was very relaxing to do. I made a couple of these. I wanted to make 3. I didn't get to the third one. I only did 2, but I just like turned on the TV and went to town painting. It was a lot of fun. And I just made some like bigger ones, some smaller ones. I wanted some to like overlap with the stem so that they looked like they were more to the front, and it just looks really cute. I love the way this looks. I also did keep wetting my brush just to make sure I was getting it to blend nicely. And I would go back and forth with that white and then my regular moss color just to make them, again, blend. I'm not going to make you watch me paint this entire thing. Don't worry. So once I had all of my leaves on there, I just went back in with my really fine detail brush and added those stems back into the center of the leaves so they didn't look like they were just floating there. And you can't really tell while it's wet, but if you look at those bottom two leaves, you can see that when it dries, it darkens up a bit, and you can tell that the leaves are hanging on that stem and not just on top of it and sitting there floating. The last step that I'm going to do for this is I took some more scrap wood from my garage. We always have these tiny little pieces in the garage for my husband when he does his flags, and I'm going to stain them with Minwax Early American. This is going to be my frame for the art. Then I'm just going to take some wood glue once the stain had dried, and I glue my pieces together. I also hold them down with a clamp while the glue dries. And I just put a piece of wax paper underneath so the glue didn't stick to my desk surface. Here I'm taking the clamp, pushing it together nice and tight until it dries, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Last, I'm just taking some CA glue. This is the super glue that has an accelerator so it dries really quickly, and I just glue my canvas down. I don't think I show this part, but I trim off the excess of the canvas that's hanging off the frame a little bit. I just took my X-Acto knife and it trimmed that right off. But that's it for this one. Mine was free because I had all of this material on hand, and the ones I could find on Etsy ranged between like $20 if it was just a print reproduction, and all the way up to like $100 if it was a set of that someone actually handmade. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments. I think it looks so great, and I plan on putting this in my bathroom. That will be the next room makeover that I'm going to do on my channel. It's going to take a few months because it is a full gut job, but stay tuned for that. Alright, so this project's using basket weaving reed that are easy to recreate, and here's the materials you will need for the first one. The reed, of course, which is linked in my description box. I got that from Amazon. Wood glue. I'm using wood glue super glue from Dollar Tree, and then binder clips. We're making a tobacco basket here, which I'm so excited about. I've been wanting to make my own for quite a while now. Before we get started, you want to find a box or something that's the size and shape you want your basket to be. I'm using a 12 by 12 cube storage bin for mine, which made my basket about 14 by 14 inches. So I start out wrapping the reed around the top of the cube, and I wrapped it 2 times. For the second layer, I added wood glue and the binder clips as clamps to hold the reed in shape while it dries. This process does take some time because you need to wait for the glue to harden between each step before moving on. Once I got back to where the reed started, I cut it off just using scissors. This stuff cuts really easy. Then I set this aside to dry for about an hour. Next, I'm going to create the cross section you see in the middle of the tobacco baskets. Usually they look like a diamond pattern. Now, I should have done this a little bit different, and I'll explain that, but I cut 4 strips to the length I wanted that section to be. Then when I went to attach them, this is what I should have done different. I was forcing the end of the reed to sit flat with the edge of the basket, which caused the reed to twist a little bit. I should have let the reed lay flat and then cut an angle on the end of it. I hope that makes sense. Here's an image I found on Pinterest that shows what I mean. But I got all 4 pieces on and then glued the cross sections together and set this aside for another hour to dry. Now I can add the woven section. For this, I glued the end of the reed to the top of the basket,
and then cut where it was needed. I didn't want to cut all the pieces at once, and some end up being too long or too short. This way there was no waste and each piece fit perfectly. I did 5 strips going each direction, and when I got to the weave portion, I did cut down the first piece, but for the rest I wove it through the existing pieces, glued down the end, and then cut the opposite end. I think that's the better way to do this, but you certainly could cut the strips down if you want to work with a smaller piece. You also want to make sure to alternate the pieces, so if the first one's starting going over, the next should start under. And don't weave the reed through the diamond section we created first. I let this section dry for another hour and then cut off any of the pieces that were sticking up higher than the rim of the basket. I started with my scissors, but I did go back in with my box cutter, which made it look much cleaner. Now to clean up the edges where all the strips are glued down, I wrapped the side with another layer of the reed. And then I tacked the center diamond section down to the woven part of the basket because that was starting to stick up a little bit. Next, I sanded down the edges since there's a lot of little frayed bits and was debating staining the basket or leaving it as is. Most tobacco baskets I've seen are a darker wood, so I did end up staining it with my Valspar antiquing glaze. You can find this at Lowe's, and I used a paintbrush and watered it down so it wasn't too dark and got into all those cracks a little easier. That's it for this basket. It is not perfect. I don't love the center design on this one, but it looks pretty good for my first ever basket. This is a fence post that was in the 70% off section of Home Depot. I'm assuming because it has like gouges taken out of the wood. So I got it 70% off, and we are going to cut this guy down into houses. I'm sorry my shoulder is completely in the way here, but I'm just measuring how tall I want my houses to be from the base to the peak of the roof. And I ended up getting this $20 fence post for only $2 from that 70% off section at Home Depot. Such a great deal. To cut them down, I'm using the big monster chop saw. And after I have my 6 blocks, I need to change the angle of my saw blade to cut the roofs. I did a few of them at 45 degrees and a few at 30 degrees. Since these wood blocks are pretty small, I didn't want to hold them, so instead I grabbed a clamp to hold the block against the saw fence, and then I can safely cut the angles for the roof. This saw creates so much dust. I wish I had a dust collector, but R2-D2 will have to work for now to clean up. Next, we need to sand everything down, and since this fence post was so rough, I used my orbital sander with an 80 grit paper. After the houses are pretty smooth, I'm going to paint them. 2 I painted with my favorite fawn color right now, watered down. 2 I watered down a white for a whitewash, and then 2 are solid black. Now I'm going to add holes into the roof for my chimney using my 7/8 inch spade bit. I needed the hole to be at an angle, and I found the easiest way to do this is to go in straight to start and then gently raise your arm while you're still drilling to create the angle for the chimney so it's straight up and down. Then using this 3/4 of an inch copper pipe I had left over from the last candlestick holder I made, I will link that video if you haven't seen it. I'm going to take my pipe cutter and cut this down for the chimneys. All that's left to do is add the candles. So here's the Pinterest version and mine. I love how minimal and modern these look. I was determined to make another project with this natural clay and see how it would turn out. Botanical art is everywhere, and I knew this would be a really quick project. So again, I rolled out some clay, used a Dollar Tree wood square as a template for the tile, and then added holes to hang them with using the end of my paintbrush. I put 2 holes in one square and then 4 holes in the other so I can connect the two together. Next, for the botanicals, I went on my front porch and clipped a few stems from my bridal veil hanging basket to use for the imprint. This is such a beautiful planter. I love how it looks. I laid the stems I cut out on my clay tiles, overlapping a few of the pieces, and then gently rolled over them to press them into the clay. You want to use wax paper here so the stems stay where you want them, but also so they don't stick to your rolling pin. The first one I didn't press down hard enough on the leaves, so they're a little bit less visible, and the second one I pressed down slightly harder. And then I used tweezers to gently lift the stems up off of the clay. Once the tiles were dry, I'm taking this leather ribbon to connect the two together. My holes were not big enough, so I gently made them bigger. Like I said earlier, this clay just crumbles, and you can see it turning into dust so easily. So I made the holes bigger and added the leather. I was being so careful, and then look at that. It broke again. So disappointing. I know this one broke because on the second one I pressed too hard and the stem went through the clay, which I didn't realize that until I was adding the leather and you could see through that spot. But I was able to glue it back together and save it. I would just not recommend this clay, you guys. It is not worth putting in all of that effort for every project to just crumble like this. I'm wondering if I bake it, if that will make it stronger. Maybe someday I'll give that a try, but for now I'm a little bit scarred by this product. The shape of the horse seat was absolutely perfect for what I had in mind here. So I need to remove the rocker base as well as the horse head and his tail. Sorry, little guy. If you haven't guessed yet, I'm turning this into a little stool. I really love the bleach wood stools I've seen from Olive Atelier, and while this one is not quite the same as theirs, I love the shape of it. But to get that light wood look, I need to remove the legs and sand everything down. I numbered the legs so I knew where to put them back, and then I removed them. I wanted to fill the screw holes in so the top is a little bit flatter. I had a dowel that was the perfect size to fit. I just need to clean up the holes a little bit. This rocking horse seems like it was pretty old and that wood was rough. So I used a 3/8 inch spade bit to clear out the holes and then cut down bits of the dowel. I made them longer than I needed to so I can flush cut them off later. Then I added wood glue into the holes and made sure to spread it all around with a paintbrush. I popped the dowel in so it was nice and snug and then set this aside to dry. The glue is set up for a little bit and I can cut off that excess dowel. I'm using a flush cut saw to do this to get a nice close cut. This is going to save me some time in the sanding process. So next I'm taking the pieces out to my garage to sand them down and get that stain off. I've never bleached wood before, but I would imagine you have to remove any sealant or color that was previously on the wood first. I'm using regular household bleach here and pouring it into a little dish. From the research I've done, it looks like people just brush the bleach right onto the wood. They don't water it down at all, so that's what I did. I'm using an old chippy brush and painting it right onto the wood, covering all of the surfaces. The bleach needs time to soak into the wood and work its magic. I added the second coat of bleach to it and I'm happy with the color now. The bottom side of the legs isn't quite dry, but that's okay, we can still move on. Something I didn't work out though at the beginning was adding the legs back on. I've filled in those screw holes and I didn't want to see screws on top. I also didn't really need to add the numbers since I sanded them off of the seat part. It did help though to know which ones belong next to each other since they have different angles. But I applied wood glue to the bottom of each leg and added it to the seat. You want to apply enough glue here so that it squeezes out on the sides. This is going to create a nice section with the wood, especially since we aren't going to use any screws. Then I added some clamps to hold the legs on tight while the glue dries. While the stool is really simple, I wanted to share how you can find an item at the thrift store with a great shape and turn it into something that works for you to give it a new life. Pottery Barn website, I found this simple heart-framed art piece, which is perfect for my style. I don't really decorate for Valentine's Day, and this piece doesn't scream Valentine's to me. And we can make it for way less than $179. I had this old canvas piece that I made a few years ago, but never shared on my channel, and I've never used it anywhere, so it's time to get a makeover. First, I need to remove all of that thread that makes up the image. Next, I needed to create a blank canvas and covered the top with 2 layers of gesso. Obviously, if you have a blank canvas or frame to use, you wouldn't need to take these steps first. Alright, while the gesso is drying, I'm gonna mix up some paper mache. This is instant paper mache that you can buy from any craft store or on Amazon. I'll link it in my description box. But all you have to do is add some water and mix it up. I scooped out way too much for this project. You only need a really tiny amount. Once the gesso is dry, I pulled up the Pottery Barn image and sketched out the hearts on my canvas. I highly recommend sketching out any design you're making first, because you can always erase your mistakes or fix any areas that don't look quite right before adding on the paper mache. And you do not have to use paper mache to get this look. The Pottery Barn version is made out of resin. You could also use clay or anything that created a moldable 3D design on the canvas. Now we can add the paper mache. I used my spatula and scooped out thin lines of the mache and started adding it right over top of the lines that I drew. Then I used my fingers to shape and smooth it out. I kept wetting my fingers so the paper mache didn't stick to my hands while I was molding it. Once the paper mache was all added to the canvas, I set it aside to dry overnight. Then I'm taking the color Buttercream by Dixie Belle to paint the entire thing. The Pottery Barn version is bright white, but I wanted more of a warm off-white for mine, and I gave the canvas and paper mache 2 coats. Next, I want to add a frame to take this canvas to the next level and look more high-end, but also to look more like the inspiration. My husband bought me this mini table saw last month for my birthday, and I could not wait to use it. I'll link it in my description box if you're in the market for one as well. But I had these scrap trim pieces from a failed home project and decided to use them here. I just need to miter the corners to create a frame, and this little saw is perfect for a small job like that. Now, when you're cutting trim or molding like this that has a curved detail to it, you actually need to cut it upside down in order for the corners to meet up correctly. So I set my guide to 45-degree angle and cut down all of the sides to fit around my canvas. The height of the saw blade is adjustable, which I forgot about when making these cuts, so it didn't cut all the way through, but I was able to just bend the plastic and snap it right off, so it wasn't a big deal. I used hot glue to attach the frame pieces, but you could use something stronger if you choose. I cut the last trim piece a little bit too long and it wasn't sitting quite right, so I went back and cut a tiny bit off, and then the corner didn't line up as nicely as the rest of the frame, but that's okay. I took some spackle and filled in the gap.
I painted the frame buttercream as well, although I do think it would look nice white for a little contrast. The Pottery Barn piece was all the same color, so I painted the frame, and that's it for this piece. I had all these materials on hand already, so this project didn't cost me anything compared to the $179 price tag of the original. Project, I'm going to recreate this terracotta textured vase. And I'm going to use one of these clear glass vases that I still have left over from my wedding 5 years ago, and I'm just slowly making my way through them. But I'm just grabbing some more of that joint compound, smothering it all over my vase, and you don't need to worry about it being super smooth at this point. We're going to fix that here in just a second. So once you have all of your joint compound on, you're going to take one of these, I want to call it a mudding knife. I could be totally wrong. I know my husband just told me what these things are called. But you're going to take this spatula thing that you use for drywall and smooth out your joint compound as much as you can. This was a little difficult to do though. So once I let that dry for several hours, I'm going to come back. You can see there's like a big crack down the center of it, which it bothered me at first, but once everything was done, you really couldn't see it that much. So I'm going to take my sanding block and sand down this joint compound even more to make it as smooth as I can get it. Next, I am just taking some painter's tape and we're going to tape off our sections for where we want the colored paint to go. Now, I'm a little disappointed that I didn't get this the tape exactly how I wanted it placed, and I didn't realize it at first, but anyways, we're gonna paint the bottom of it black. I wanted there to be like a bigger variation in like the high-low, but it still looks great. And then we're gonna paint the top of it with ivory. So I covered off the bottom after we painted the black. I probably should have saved that until we were done with the splatter part. But then I'm just going to take a dry, stiff brush and we're going to splatter some different colors on here. I used a dark gray and then I used like this terracotta color. And then I also used like this is mineral, so it's like a gray brownish color. And I found this was actually the best method for getting like the large splatter paint dots on there. When I was holding the jar, I was just getting the paint all over my room and not all over the jar. But next I'm gonna take the tape off and I'm gonna paint that center section with the pink. And I don't show that because you don't need to watch me paint all of this. It's self-explanatory. So for the last little, well, not last step, second to last step here, we're going to take this little like poking tool, I think it is. I got this from the Dollar Tree, but it's just very sharp and I'm going to use this to etch into that joint compound all the way around the seams where the colors meet. So I do that all the way around and then I also go vertical to create the lines, and I use my roller to get a straight line here and then just kind of like took the little carving poking tool and like etched out. I didn't go all the way down to the glass here, but it just created those nice little lines. And then the last thing we're gonna do is take this metallic rose gold folk art paint, and I'm just going to take a tiny little detail brush and paint in all of those etched marks. And that's it for this one. This was such an easy project and another one that you could totally make your own. You could paint this whatever colors match your home decor or your aesthetic. You could create so many different designs and etched looks in here. You could have so much fun with this, and I plan on creating some other variations. All right, this one is definitely the most difficult
It took me a few tries before I got it. I saw a girl on Pinterest make this one, but she showed the knot one time and it was in fast motion. So I must have watched that video 500 times. So today I'm breaking it down for you. You need 4 cords at 110 inches, and I used the 4mm again, and just pull them through the wood ring or a metal ring, whatever ring you have. No knot yet on this one. Next, separate the cords so you have 4 pairs. I'm going to show you this in real time, but remember you can always slow down the video if you want to recreate this. Okay, starting with the far left pair, create a 4 with the second pair over top of the straight part. Now you're going to twist, so the first pair is now hanging down and the second pair continues to the right. Create another 4 with that second pair and bring the third pair on top. Twist it again so the second pair flows down and the third pair continues on. And this time, you take the far right pair behind all of the cords and through that first 4. Tight here is a little tricky. You want to just play around with it, pulling each section until there are no loose parts of the knot. And this creates more of a circular design instead of a flat design. Okay, now we're going to continue repeating this knot until the top of the hanger is as long as you want it. I'll show you again in case you want to follow along. Start with the far left pair and make a 4. Pull the second pair on top of the straight portion of the 4. Twist so the first pair hangs down and the second pair continues to the right. Here's what the wrap will look like. I made this about 6 inches long. So now I'm going to knot off the bottom for the planter to sit inside. I recommend doing this part with your macrame hanging rather than on a flat surface. This got confusing and I ended up having to redo it because I was tying the wrong cords together. For the first knot, you just take each pair and tie a basic knot. That one's easy. Here's where I got confused on where each knot belonged, but you repeat the same process, moving down, leaving about 5 inches of cord between each knot. This will also depend on how large the planter you put in the hanger is. I have a 6-inch pot in mine. Next, you want to close the hanger by gathering all the cords together and adding a wrap. You can add more knots if you want. You would just repeat the process until you have as many as you're happy with. I hope I explained how to create this one in a way that you can follow and understand. Give it a try, and remember, you can always undo the knots and start over.
This next project, I'm taking this gallon jug that I got from the Goodwill for $2.99. And the first thing I'm going to do is clean it up really good with some crud cutter. And this project is a little difficult to explain, but I definitely show you in detail what I'm doing. Now that it's clean, I'm taking some black craft wire that I got from Hobby Lobby for $3.99.
And I used a coupon, so I only paid maybe around $2, a little more than $2 for it. So I'm gonna cut a small strip to go around the neck of the bottle, and you can see I just twisted it on around there to stay. And then I cut 6 more strips of the wire that are about, I'd say maybe 2.5 feet long. They're not quite 3 feet, but they're definitely longer than 2. And I'm gonna loop each one around that top piece that I put around the neck. So what I'm gonna create is like a chicken wire type look all the way around this jug. The first thing I'm gonna do now is take 2 separate wires. So I'm gonna take the left side and the right side of 2 wires, and I'm gonna form like a little triangle at the top of the bottle. And then I'm gonna twist those wires around 3 times. At first I only do 2 and then realized it needed to have 3 twists to stay nice and tight there. So then I'm gonna move on. I'm gonna take the second half of that first wire that I used and then a second wire next to it, and we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna form that little triangle at the top so you can see how those 2 are connected, but it's just the second half of that looped on wire. And I wanted to make sure everything was the same length as I was going around, so I wasn't pulling one side to be shorter than another, because I didn't want to run out of the wire too soon at the bottom. I do wish I had cut this a little bit longer because it doesn't completely go to the bottom of the bottle, but that's okay. I think it still looks great. It was a little tricky going around that handle part. So here's how it looks with all the little triangles around the top. And now we're gonna move down to the next section. So I'm gonna take one of these wires that's twisted over toward the left and one that's twisted over toward the right, or I guess I said that backwards, but you know what I mean. And I'm gonna twist those 2 together, and we're now gonna form like a teardrop shape. And I'm gonna do that same thing again all the way around the bottle. So that second half that's coming over toward the left and the other one that's coming toward the right, and twist that around. As I go down the bottle, the little openings get a little bit larger. So now we're gonna move down to the next section. It's gonna kind of form like a diamond or almost like hexagon-ish looking shape. And you can always mold them a little bit to be how you want, like I'm doing here, since it's pretty flexible wire. So now I'm gonna do that same thing, and I'm gonna do this, repeat that same process all the way down the jar. Don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying my videos so that you don't miss whenever I post anything new. I post every Monday right now, and when there's collaborations that I would like to participate in, I'm gonna try and post more than one a week if it's not on a Monday. Like this one happens to be on a Monday, so it was perfect timing. But definitely make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell so you know anytime I upload. So at the bottom, I added another little piece like I did at the top, just around the jug. And then I'm gonna take those leftover wire parts at the bottom and just twist those around so it looks a little more finished. The next thing I'm gonna do is take some more wire, and I wanna create like a little corkscrew looking guy. So I'm gonna twist it around this screwdriver a few times. I think I twisted maybe like 6 times around. You can kind of see how it has that little like corkscrew effect. And I'm just gonna snip it off right at the base of the circle. And then at the beginning, I left a little piece off. So you can see how there's that little straight piece, and I'm gonna use that to attach it to the wire already on the jar. So right where those 2 wires intersected and twisted together, that's where I'm gonna place this. And I just twist it right on there. It stays nice and secure. You don't need to use glue or anything. And I do this all the way around every section of the bottom, and then I skip about 2 rows and do the same thing. I do it on every intersection 2 rows up. I didn't want them to be right over top of each other. And then I go all the way up to the top of the jar and I do every other section. And this is a little different from the inspiration. The inspiration had a lot more and looked a little bit different, but you'll see that here in a second. That's it. This one was from Kirkland's and it was $59.99 and mine cost $4.50. So just add a plant to it and you're all set. This next 11-year-old picked out this first project and really wanted me to make a mini plant ladder. I was going to make it out of scrap wood, but thought it would be perfect using these blocks. I started out gluing 4 blocks end to end using regular wood glue. This is going to be the smaller top shelf. Now, I wanted my shelves to have a staggered look with the blocks, which required me to cut several blocks in half, but you could certainly make straight stacked rows if you don't have a saw to cut the blocks. And this shelf is 4 blocks wide by 4 blocks long, and the second shelf is 4 blocks wide by 4.5 blocks long. Next, I made 4 5-block pieces. I figured you don't want to keep watching me glue blocks together, so here's where we are so far. Now I need to attach 2 of the 5-block pieces to make an open bottom triangle. I don't know what you would call that shape. But this part almost caused me to give up on this project. I had to figure out most of it off camera because I was getting so frustrated. I cut the angle way too long and deep, so the side wasn't as wide as I wanted it to be. So I cut that top block off, glued a new one on, and cut a smaller angle. And that worked great for the first side. But when I tried to replicate it for the second side, I couldn't get the pieces to line up. There was a large gap between the 2 pieces where I couldn't get glue on enough of the surface, so I had to add a shim to the second side. Once the glue was dried, I cut the tips flat, that way the top of the ladder can sit on it. Okay guys, I have all of my pieces ready to go to build this plant ladder. So we have our little like triangular pieces. These are going to be the sides, and then we're going to put our shelves in between here. And then this is the top of our plant ladder. So this is a 2x4 block. I changed this to be staggered like the shelves and only 3 blocks wide, but 2.5 long. And then we have our 2 shelves. So one is slightly longer than the other. And then we have our rungs for the shelves to sit on. So I have 4 of these 2 block pieces, 1x2. I guess we'll call them. All right, now we can put everything together and build this piece. I next needed to figure out where the shelves are going to go on the ladder. I don't want to attach the sides directly to the shelves, so that's why I have the rungs. But they're a little too tall, so I cut them down to the height that I wanted, and then drilled a pilot hole through the side and down into the rung so the screw doesn't split the wood and attach them together. Getting the second side on was a little bit tricky. My craft table is not level, and I always forget that when building projects like this. So the shelf ended up being level lengthwise, but has a slight decline from the front to the back. Then I did the same thing for the top shelf. I'm not sure why I didn't show it. I must have forgot to hit record, but I just used wood glue and attached the top piece. And last, I stained it up with special walnut, and that's it for this one. I love how you can make some larger scale projects with these blocks. I ended up using 61 blocks, just under the 63 that came in a box. For this decor piece, I took inspiration from this vase or planter pot I saw at Target in the Studio McGee new line. I love the texture on it, and I knew I could easily recreate this using things I already have lying around. Now, I know this Dollar Tree planter is not the same shape, but I still think it works to get that overall look. To start out, I'm going to take this acrylic gesso. I've never used gesso before, but I see a lot of art channels do that, and I really liked it for adding a primer base to a project, and will definitely continue using this. The outside of my planter got 2 coats, and I gave the inside one really light coat about 1/3 of the way down. Next, I'm going to use this shelf liner, which has the exact same texture pattern that was on the Studio McGee vase. At first, I was going to wrap it around, but realized that didn't really work so well. So instead, I cut the liner into 2-inch strips. Then using Mod Podge, I started applying the strips. The shape of this vase causes them to overlap a little bit in order to cover the whole surface, and the last strip I only added on the top half to cover that bare section. This can be the back that no one's going to see. Once the Mod Podge was dry, I wanted to wrap the top of the shelf liner inside of the pot. This wasn't working well at first, and what I realized I was doing was adding too much Mod Podge and not allowing time for it to get tacky and hold that strip down. Since the pieces folding over are so tiny, it really needed that tack to stay in place. After this layer is dry, I'm taking ivory paint and gave the vase 2 coats. To get that glossy look that the Studio McGee piece has, you could add polyacrylic or a spray sealer or even Mod Podge. I used a gloss Mod Podge, and that's it for this one. I've been wanting to recreate one of these stunning restoration hardware vessels for a while, and I'm finally doing it. I've had this large vase in my stash for years, just waiting for the right project, and the shape is perfect for this dupe. I cleaned it up with some crud cutter and then grabbed some of my Sculpey air dry clay. Since the rim of the RH vessel was more prominent and rounded, and also looked a little bit more handmade and not perfect, so adding the clay will really help achieve that look. I rolled it out into a long snake until it would cover the rim of the vase, and then I slightly pushed it down on top of the vase so the rim indents the clay. You want to be careful here not to distort the shape of the clay too much, and I used some water to smooth the seam where the edges meet the best that I could. You can see the indent from the rim when I take the clay off to add that glue, and I use my Titebond quick and thick glue to adhere it. This works really well on glass and on clay. I also made sure to wipe any glue that seeped out of the bottom off. It's okay if you don't get it all because we're going to be adding several layers to this vessel, but you don't want it to dry with big globs of glue or have it look like drips. Once the glue is dry, I'm painting the whole thing in Coffee Bean by Dixie Belle. This is a rich, deep brown color. I recently bought these large, round, pointed brushes, and I love them for painting surfaces like this. After the coffee bean color dried, I went over that with a bronze by Dixie Belle. This is actually a patina paint, but I'm just using it as a metallic paint and not going to patina it. The RH vessel looked like the top rim was more of a bronze or a deep metallic color, and then the distressed areas were a deep brown. I thought I'd be able to sand some areas to have both that bronze and the brown show through, but that didn't really work out. It just went straight to that brown color. Alright, now it's time for the fun part. Since I bought this big bag of plaster of Paris for my plaster coffee table, I wanted to use the plaster on a vase as well. But I was definitely nervous with how quickly plaster of Paris starts to set. You only have about 5 minutes to work with it, which doesn't leave a lot of time to just play around. While I love the way this vessel turned out, I would recommend using a joint compound or spackle instead. But I mixed up the plaster with 1 part of cool water to 2 parts of plaster and started applying it with a 2-inch chippy brush. I wanted a lot of texture and layers, which is why I used the chippy brush. I didn't cover the vase fully and purposely left areas that showed the bronze underneath. Once that dried, I sanded the plaster to smooth it a little bit and bring out more of that bronze, and then repeated this a few times to build up the layers.
I was at the wrong place at the right time, 'cause suddenly there you were with those bright blue eyes. We were conversing under the night sky, when you took my hand, said let's leave now. Don't wanna be shy, I will let my guard down. Don't wanna be shy, I will let my guard down.
I wanted to see some more depth and deeper areas in the plaster that go all the way down to that paint layer, so I grabbed one of my clay tools to start scraping the plaster away. This was awful to do. The sound of the tools on the plaster was like nails on a chalkboard, and I had horrible goosebumps the entire time I was doing this. But it was worth it for that look that I wanted. This added more dimension, which is what I was going for. However, I wasn't able to keep the tools from removing the paint layer. It was scraping everything off right down to the glass. So I spray painted the inside of the vase with metallic antique brass. And again, this is adding another layer and another element to the piece. All right, I'm pretty happy with how the base is starting to look, so now I need to figure out how I can get that ridge detail at the top of the vase similar to the RH one. It took me a few days, but I decided to take some of my Dixie Belle mud and tint it brown. Now, Dixie Belle does make a dark mud, and I should have used that, but I didn't have it on hand. And since the one I was using was already tinted white, it really changed the color of the paint I had added. My mud was also a little bit dried out, so I added some water in with the paint and mixed it all up. It definitely turned more gray than the dark brown I wanted, but it is what it is. I found this icing comb set at the Dollar Tree, and one of the combs has teeth on it that are perfect to get that ridge textured look. So I spread the mud on with a plastic palette knife and then went in an angled motion. And then I combed it out to add that detail. I didn't pay much attention to how far I was dragging the mud down. I wanted it to be very random. And then I let this layer dry. This project does require a lot of dry time in between all of those layers. Next, I took a sanding sponge and lightly sanded the ridges just to knock off any of those sharp spots. Then I took more mud, untinted this time, and spread it over the base. The RH version also had lines running down the entire vessel. They were more like drip lines from the rice wine that would run down the same spot over and over, creating those indents. But I couldn't think of a way to recreate that exact look. So instead of taking the wider side of the comb and just adding some lines into the mud. I also took some of the white mud up onto that grayish brown ridge part so it wasn't so clean looking, and again adds some more detail, dimension, and layers to this piece. I know it seems like this is a lot of work, but the outcome is just stunning. It's been a while since I've done a vase like this, and they are some of my most loved projects, so I hope you enjoyed this one as well.
For this project, I'm duping a frosted votive, which is really popular right now. I've been seeing these all over the place. And I know you can get that stained glass or colored glass look using food coloring, but I didn't have any food coloring when I started this, so I thought, what if I use paint and water it down? The votive color I'm duping is a blush color, but the photos make it look like it has a little bit more of a brown tint as well. So I used a tan, red, yellow, and light pink color acrylic paint and made the perfect color. Once I was happy with the color, I added in the Mod Podge because you need a glue for the color to absorb into and stick to your glass. You do want to water it down as well. I forgot to do that at first, but quickly realized the mixture was just way too thick. Next, I'm taking a hurricane glass and pouring the Mod Podge paint water mixture down the sides and rolling the glass around until it is evenly coated. Once the glass is coated inside, if there are any bubbles, you want to pop those or they will show up on your finished piece. And then set it upside down for a little bit to let any excess paint drip out. Next, I put it into the oven at 250 degrees for what should have only been an hour, but I left it in there for several hours, and this paint was just not working. It was still super thick and opaque, not at all what I was looking for. The good thing is, since this is glue and acrylic paint, I could peel it right off and start over. So I did the same thing again, only using a tiny amount of paint and a lot more water. It worked a little bit better, but it still was not quite right, so I gave in and ordered some food coloring from Amazon. Using these colors, I mixed them into my Mod Podge, added a little bit of water, coated the inside of my glass, and then stuck it in the oven for an hour. And it was perfect. Now we just need to add the frosted look. But man, you guys, this project was really trying to knock me down, and I just kept on going because I really wanted to figure it out. I don't know if there is a white frosted glass spray paint, but apparently I bought clear. And as soon as I started spraying it, I was wondering why the heck there was not white, but it was giving that frosted kind of look. So now I'm running out of time. This was Monday evening for the video posting Friday. So I looked around my craft room and found this faux snow spray that I bought last Christmas but never used. So let's give it a try. Why not? To my surprise, this was the perfect medium to add and get that white, frosty look to dupe the Magnolia votive. I did have to spray it on, let it dry, wipe off the texture, and slowly keep building it up until I was happy with the look. And the color of the glass did lighten a bit with everything that was added on top of it, but I really love the look that I got. The Magnolia one is only $12, and had I known the struggle this was going to put me through, I probably would not have bothered, but in the end, I'm so glad I kept going and figured it out. This one, I'm taking my Craft Smart polymer clay and rolled it out and then cut out a bunch of squares using a cutter. Next, I took each of the squares and held it so one of the corners is facing up, more like a diamond, and then I rolled in the two sides onto each other, but then folded the corners back out to make a petal shape. I wanted the petals to look organic and not like they were all identical, so I pinched the back and kind of bent it in different directions. The Anthropologie version has more pointed looking petals, so I also gently pulled on the top to elongate them. Once I had a few petals made, I started adding them to a vase. And since the bottom of the petals is rolled in and comes to a point, I used that part to mold it to the vase. I also used this liquid Sculpey, which acts as a glue, and added a dab under each petal so it stays in place once it's baked. I rolled up the rest of my petals and added them to the vase, trying to closely mimic the shape of the Anthropologie version. And once I had all of the petals attached, I put the vase into the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes. Then turned the oven off and let the glass cool down inside. I made 2 vases and spray painted them, which apparently I didn't hit record for, but I used heirloom white on one and khaki on the other, both by Rust-Oleum, and that was it for these. I love the way they turned out, and I only had to spend money on one of the spray paints, but if you had to buy everything, this would cost about $28 for both compared to Anthropologie at $90. these hanging planters all over my Pinterest feed for the last few months and finally decided I need to make one. So I'm taking one of these nesting boxes from the Dollar Tree along with 2 medium-sized wreath rings that I got from Walmart. I have seen these at Dollar Tree, but not recently. I do have a whole Christmas video using the Dollar Tree ones for even more ideas. To attach the rings to the box, I'm grabbing my bronze eye pins from this variety pack. I will need 4 of these as well as 4 bronze jump rings. I got both of these from Amazon and will link them in my description box. Next, I found where I wanted the rings to sit on the sides of the box and marked where the screw would go and then added the eye pins. It was a little difficult to get them started. I ended up taking a small nail and hammered it so the screw would have kind of a pilot hole. And then you want to make sure the hook part is facing horizontal rather than vertical. Once both eye pins were screwed in on one side, I added the jump rings into the hook and then attached the wreath ring before closing up the jump rings. And then repeated this process of adding the eye pins, jump rings, and wreath ring to the other side of the box. Now, the wreath rings will not automatically lean into each other, so to get that look, I'm using 2mm macrame cord. You could use jute twine, yarn, whatever you have, but I glued the starting end of the cord to the ring using my Starbond super glue. I would not recommend using hot glue here if you want the project to hold up over time. Then I wrapped the center of the rings together as long as I wanted it to be, and then glued the end back down. You could stop here, add a hanger, and be done. I wanted to add a little bit more detail to the top, so I took this wood ring, also from Amazon. All of my Amazon products will be linked below for you, but to attach it, I glued it down first to hold it in place, and then I wrapped more macrame cord around it a few times. I think my camera died for that part though. I also added a few wood beads in various sizes to another cord that would be the hanger. And to finish it off, I'm adding a loop and a wrap. So to make the wrap, create a loop as long as you want it for the very top where you will put it on a hook. Then take a separate cord and place it on top of the loop, making sure the end is sticking up, and then create a second loop going the opposite direction with the loose cord and make it longer than you want your wrap section to be. Now wrap all of the cords together. When you have it as long as you want, take the end of the wrapping cord and put it through the bottom loop. Then go back to the top loop, pull that cord tight. This will create a knot and conceal the knot inside of the wrap for a nice clean look. Now cut off the loose ends and that's it. Stick a plant in the box, hang it up and enjoy. I created this little plant nook when I made my living room built-ins and I love the way it's coming together. Let me know what you think about this project.
Project is super easy. I saw these glass bead garlands on the Pottery Barn website and loved the update to the wood bead garland that's been around for a few years. I bought this large pack of mini clear ornaments at Hobby Lobby around Christmas time and had half of the container left that I didn't use. These are perfect to get that same look, but you could also use ping pong balls, which was my original idea. I just didn't have any on hand. I removed the top hanger from the ornaments, and then since they're plastic, I was able to use my hot knife and remove the top of the ornament. You could also just use an X-Acto knife to do this. What I love about these ornaments is that they all have a different pattern to them, but they're still clear. Originally, I wanted to do the sea glass look, but realized I didn't have any sea glass spray paint, and that stuff is pretty expensive. So this version added texture and intrigue just through the patterns. Once I had all of the tops off, I also needed to add a hole to the opposite side to feed a string through it and make that garland. I wanted to use a spade bit, but couldn't find my smallest one, so I tried out a drill bit and that worked great. Now to string them up, I'm using twine, which is what the Pottery Barn versions looked like they used as well. I taped off the end of the twine to feed it through the holes easier, and then it cut off a strand long enough to go through all of my ornaments. I had to add a little extra to account for the knots I needed to add in as well. I don't love how frayed jute twine looks, so I took my lighter to singe off all those messy bits. You do not need to do this step. It can be a little scary when the flame travels up the twine so close to your hand, so please use caution if you do this. Now all you need to do is tie a knot at the end and start stringing the ornaments on. For the end knot, I had to tie 3 times so the large hole doesn't slip right over it. And then I tied double knots for everyone after that. I strung on an ornament, tied a knot right up against that hole so there wasn't any slack, and then strung on the next ornament. I added 11 ornaments onto this garland because I don't like even numbers on things like this, but like I said, such an easy DIY project, and I created this one for free where Pottery Barn is charging between $50 and $100 for theirs. You could get 2 packs of ping pong balls from the Dollar Tree and spend $2.50 to make your own version. This project is Pinterest inspired, my favorite place to get inspiration. I've had these pole noodles lying around in my craft room for quite a while now, and it's finally time to use them. I know pole noodles are hard to find this time of year, so you can also use toilet paper or paper towel rolls to get this same look. I cut the noodles down into various heights and ended up with 10 candle pieces. Then at first I held them together with rubber bands and started painting the pole noodles black, but then I realized it was easier to take all of them apart and paint individually, then put them back together using my super glue to hold them in place. Next, I'm taking my hot glue gun to create the wax strips from the candles. You want to be really careful doing this because if the glue is too hot, it will melt the pole noodle foam. I ended up switching over to my low temp hot glue gun to prevent it from melting, and then it painted over all of the hot glue with my black paint again. Now I want to put LED tea light candles into the tops of the pole noodles, so I cut out a hole big enough to fit them with my X-Acto knife. For the base where the candles are going to sit, I'm taking this Dollar Tree pizza pan and painting it in a custom purple color that I mixed up. I wanted to do a crackle effect with that purple peeking through, so next I'm taking my crackle medium to put on top of the purple paint. I don't know if it's this product in particular, but it did not crackle at all after I put the black paint on top of it. I even tried to use my heat gun for more of that crackle look. It looks like it almost has scratches on the surface of the paint rather than that crackle effect. Let me know in the comments if you've tried this crackle medium or if there's a better one out there because I really like that look, but I can't seem to figure out how to get this one to work. So I decided to decoupage over top of this instead using this skull napkin that I found at Walmart. I love how you can see hints of that purple paint coming through the napkin, even though this will mostly be covered up. All that's left to do now is decorate the candles. I used several items from Dollar Tree, including these purple flowers with the eyes in them, some spiders, skulls, blackberries, and oh, I painted the tea lights black as well. That's it for this one. I love how this turned out. It is so fun for Halloween.
I am taking these 6-inch dowels from the Dollar Tree, so they're the smaller size ones, and I'm going to again use my T-square, and we are going to make a square. I want to make sure that everything is all nice and straight and my angles are perfectly 90 degrees. And I didn't think about it at first, but I should have made 2 squares and then glued in the side pieces, because we're going to be making a box or a cube, whatever you want to call it. But that was an afterthought and I didn't think about it at first. I wasn't planning on making it an actual box. I just wanted the side pieces for structure, but I ended up needing the top as well. Now I'm just going to add in all of the side pieces. Again, using my square just to make sure everything is nice and straight. And here's what the piece should look like when it's all complete. So you can see how those 2 I have, they're kind of sticking up rather than being flush. And that's why I should have created 2 squares and then added those center posts. So next I'm going to take some burlap fabric that I got from a girl who, after her wedding, she just didn't want these anymore. She had 20 table runners and I got them all from her. So I'm going to have plenty of this to work with for a long time. But I'm just going to glue it right up against this edge. This is where I cut it. So I cut them maybe like 1/3 of the table runner. I want it to wrap around this square 2 times. Then I'm just going to cut that raw edge off so that it's nice and flush against the dowel. And I make sure that the seam, the finished seam along the bottom is right up against that bottom dowel, but covering it. And on this first layer of burlap, I want to make it pretty tight. So I want to make sure it's pretty secure around there. After I have that first layer down, the next one I'm just going to glue down the bottom of it because I want it to have that slouchy look. Definitely make sure to use something other than your fingers to push it down, because that hot glue seeps right through the burlap. And then when you get to the end, I made sure that that finished seam was on the outside and I just pushed it right up against that corner. Next, I'm taking the part that was hanging over above the cube and I'm going to fold it down 2 times, making sure that those corners do come over top of the dowel. So you can see I'm going to pull it down here just to make sure that it's all nice and snug, but just don't push too hard because you definitely don't want to break this box. It's only held on with that hot glue. And the last thing I'm going to do is just take some yarn that I had from the Dollar Tree. You could use any color you want. You could do this in any design or any pattern that you want, but I just added in some horizontal rows or lines and I just added them wherever I thought it looked nice. I did this all the way around all 4 sides and then all the way up until you got to that folded over edge. So I just didn't do anything on the fold. And I love the way this turned out. Again, this is something that could fit into several different home decor styles. I'm not really into farmhouse, but it would definitely fit that theme or that decor style as well. This was super simple and super quick and easy to do. Like I said, you could do any design or pattern you wanted to here. So here's the inspiration. It was from a company called River City for $25 and mine cost $5 to make.
are seen everywhere right now in home stores and home styling. So that's going to be our first project today. I actually saw Wendy over at White Sparrow Living create this, and I knew I had to do something similar. So I got these tombstone looking styrofoam pieces from the Dollar Tree. I picked up 8 of them. You do want to make sure you remove that little metal piece that is the stake that holds them into the ground. And then I'm going to start hot gluing them together. So I have 8 and I'm creating 2 stacks of 4 of the styrofoam tombstones glued together. So here's the 2 sets of 4 glued together, and they don't resemble anything even close to the shape of a dough bowl. So what I'm gonna do is take my pencil and just start outlining where I want to cut down these styrofoam tombstones at. And then I'm going to take it out into my garage. This was a super messy part of the process. And I'm going to take my jigsaw. I did put it on a very low setting, low speed, so that I would have better control over cutting it out. And I just started cutting down section by section. My blade was not long enough to go through all 4 of these tombstones at once, so I had to cut through like 2.5 of them, and then I would have to keep flipping it over and then cutting out the other side. And you don't have to use a jigsaw to do this. Wendy from White Sparrow Living, she used a kitchen knife, a serrated kitchen knife, and that worked great for her. I just figured if I had this tool, I might as well use it. Is easily sandable, and you can manipulate it with a sanding block or sandpaper. So I just went over top of the entire thing with my sanding block just to get out any of those lumps and bumps that were left behind from the saw blade. Now I need to cut out the middle of this. So once again, I'm taking my pencil and just outlining where I want to cut out the center. And on most dough bowls, these are hand carved pieces of wood, and the sides are a little bit thicker where you would like kind of pick it up like as if it were a handle. So I did leave that part a little bit wider, and then just taking a box cutter here, I'm just slashing up some strips in it. I ended up taking out 3 of the styrofoam tombstones, leaving 1 for the bottom base of the dough bowl. Now to cover up all of the ugliness of the styrofoam, I'm taking some poster board and just tracing out the inside. I did have to cut this down several times. I was actually really bad at tracing it, but once I finally got it figured out and it was able to fit inside of my styrofoam, I just taped that down with some painter's tape and then started cutting out strips of the poster board to angle them down, because the dough bowl sides are like at a slant. They are not straight up and down. And this is exactly what Wendy did in her project as well, which I thought was absolutely genius. So I just started bending the pieces of poster board around where I needed them to be, taping them down in place, and working my way around the entire inside of the dough bowl. Next, we're gonna do some super fun but super messy paper mache. So I'm taking this shipping paper that I got from the Dollar Tree, and I'm gonna start cutting it down into long strips. After I cut all of my long strips down, I did cut a lot of them in half so they would be a little bit smaller and easier to work with. I would recommend cutting these down to about 2-inch width strips. I think that would work out the best when it comes to overlapping the pieces of paper and getting less ripples.
Next, I'm going to take this Jot glue. This is the bigger size that they have at the Dollar Tree as well, and I'm going to start pouring it into a bowl. This bowl ended up being way too big, and I put it in a smaller one here in a second, but I'm just going to add some water to water down my mixture and make it more of the consistency that I need for the paper mache, so you can see how runny it is here. Now we can start adding in our strips of paper to the glue mixture. You want to make sure you get them pretty good and covered in the glue. I realized at first that my mixture was not quite runny enough. You can still see that it's pretty thick on there. So after I added this first strip, I did go back, add in a little bit more water so that it was a little bit thinner and easier to work with. I'm just going to start covering up the entire thing. I did end up having to do this over 2 days because I needed that glue paper mache mixture to dry on the top before I could flip it over and then do the bottom. The great thing about these dough bowls and using the paper mache as your like main medium for making this, dough bowls are hand carved wood. So all of those imperfections in the paper and the wrinkles and the lumps and bumps that you get just really did add to the authentic look of this piece. Now I do notice some of the like paper strips on my finished project, and I wish I had actually ripped them down on the edges rather than cut them off. I would have cut them lengthwise but then ripped them on the sides so that it was a little bit more seamless as they fit together. But overall, I'm still super happy and pleased with the way this turned out. But once I'm done with the paper mache part, let that all dry. I am taking Mod Podge and putting a good layer over top of the entire piece just to make sure it is all nice and sealed together and all of that paper is stuck down really well. Then we can go on to painting. So I'm starting out with this Territorial beige color by Apple Barrel. I wanted to give it kind of a lighter look. I had thought at first that's what I was going for. So that's what I'm doing here. And then I started adding in some white. I wanted to give it that kind of light wood but whitewashed effect. So I'm taking this Linen White by Rust-Oleum and I am dry brushing again over top of the entire piece. This time I gave it a really heavy dry brush of the white to pretty much cover up the entire thing. So here you can start to see how it's looking with the heavy coat of the white dry brushing, and it did look good. It just, after a day or two of sitting on it and then just looking at it, I realized it wasn't exactly what I was going for. I did want it to have more of that wood look and a darker look for my living room. So I went back in with the Territorial beige. I gave this a pretty good dry brushing over top of the entire thing once again, and then while that was still wet, I went in with the DIY dark wax. This stuff was a game changer for this project. If you haven't tried this yet, you seriously need to. I was going to use the Waverly Antique Wax, but I'm so glad that I didn't. I love the antique wax, but I think it would have given a different look and more of a warmer tone to the dough bowl, which wasn't exactly what I was going for. So I'm so happy that I used this DIY dark wax, and I just kept building it up, and especially in all of the like areas where there were wrinkles in the paper, and it just added so much depth and dimension to this piece. I am so happy with the way that it turned out. Let me know what you guys think of this in the comments. Is this something that you would ever take on? Is it way too involved for you? Do you enjoy more of the easy and simpler projects? Sometimes I just really love these larger scale projects.
I'm taking inspiration from Lulu in Georgia. I love the look of these marble risers, but at $699, I think I'll pass and make them myself for a whole lot less. You're going to need some toilet paper rolls or any other cylindrical object that you have, a wood circle, this one's from the Dollar Tree Plus section, and then some marble contact paper, and that's it. This project is super easy. Of course, you want to remove the sticker from that wood round. I always recommend to remove stickers from your projects to make them look a little bit more high-end. Then I'm going to take my toilet paper roll and measure how wide I need to cut that contact paper down. All 3 rolls fit within the length, so I just need to cut that down as well. I left a little overhang on the contact paper so that I can tuck it inside. And you can find tons of contact paper options online to match your personal style and your home decor. Your cost for this project will vary slightly depending on what you choose. Next, I'm going to wrap each toilet paper roll with the contact paper. I was a little bit surprised that the contact paper didn't stick to the cardboard as well as I thought that it would, but since I overlap it a little bit at the end and tucked in the ends, it worked out just fine. I cut a few slits all the way around and then I folded that paper inside. That way you have a nice clean looking edge. And I repeated this to cover all 3 of the toilet paper rolls. Now for the wood round, I'm so excited to show you this technique that I recently saw someone do. I cut down a long strip of the contact paper to cover that whole outside edge of the circle. And you want it wide enough so that you can wrap it around the edge and then the inside portion of that circle as well. Then I worked my way around the outside of the circle, peeling the paper backing off as I went. You don't want to pull that backing off entirely before you start, or your contact paper will likely start to stick to something that it shouldn't and cause a lot of frustration. Once I got the contact paper along the outside, I'm going to use my heat gun to shape and mold that paper to curve around the edges and onto that inside portion of the circle. This was so fascinating and magical to me. I never knew that you could heat up contact paper like this. Essentially, the heat makes the paper stretch and mold to the shape that it's covering. But you do want to be careful here not to apply too much heat. If it gets too hot, it's going to tear. I would recommend using a craft heat gun over this industrial one, but this is all that I have. So I just go very quickly over the paper, shape it, and then move on to the next section. I did that same process on the inside of the circle as well, and this made it so that I had no wrinkles in the paper whatsoever. It definitely adds to that real marble look of my inspiration piece. Next, I use my box cutter to trim down the excess contact paper and clean up that inside edge. Then I trace the circle to cut out a piece of contact paper to cover the bottom and the inside. And I use my heat gun on that inside portion to help the paper bend and mold easier. I took the box cutter to the edge again to clean it up, and now we just need to put the pieces together. I'm using hot glue to add the legs on. You can certainly use a stronger adhesive if you choose to and want this project to hold up better over time. I'm using hot glue as a quick alternative, but I made sure that the seam of the contact paper on those toilet paper rolls were all facing on the inside. Now, the inspiration came with 2 risers, so I did create a second one as well, and to make it a little bit shorter, I cut the toilet paper rolls in half. Then I just followed the exact same process we did for the white marble riser. I also added the bottom of the circle on first before wrapping the sides. This gave a slightly cleaner look, but really not too noticeable of a difference. And that's it for this set. I think they look great, and if you had to buy all of these supplies, it would cost you about $10 or so, depending on where you get that contact paper from. I'm recreating these Restoration Hardware olive jars. This is more of an inspired by than a true dupe, but close enough. I know this portion is completely out of focus, which I didn't realize until editing, so bear with me, it is only a very small portion of this project. I found these two vases at the Goodwill. They were $3.99 each, and they were the perfect texture to recreate this project. So I started out by painting both of them with my ivory colored chalk paint, and then I am going to create the baking soda mixture using hazelnut and then my baking soda. I have tried this method a few times now, and I'm really not a fan of it. I much prefer to use either joint compound or spackling as a texture additive rather than the baking soda. But I gave it one more shot. So I did just start by stippling this color all around my jar using a chippy brush, and I started going down maybe like 3 rows and just kind of gradually fading it. Then I started taking my ivory color again and going back and forth with both that hazelnut mixture and the ivory. I just started creating a gradient so that it was starting to get lighter and lighter as I went down the vase. I know you can see a gray color off to the side there. I don't mention it because I didn't end up using that color at all. All I used was the hazelnut baking soda mixture and then the ivory. And I'm doing the same thing on the top and the bottom of both of these vases, just gradually fading it and making it look like a gradient. This is the same process we have used all throughout this video of just going back and forth and playing around with your colors back and forth until you are happy with the result. And last for this project, I took a piece of my sponge in that hazelnut color, and then I just started dabbing it all over, mostly on the high points and then also in some random spots here and there. And that was all I did for this one. So here's a look at mine, $7 compared to the member version of $296 for the small olive jar from Restoration Hardware. If you are not a member, you are paying over $300, almost $400. So let me know what you think of this inspired by piece. One I already cut down my pieces, so I have 2 that are 2 feet long, 24 inches, 2 that are 8 inches, and then 4 that are about 4 inches. This is the easiest project for today. All I'm going to do is take the smallest pieces, glue and brad nail them to both ends of the longest pieces, and then take the medium-sized piece and attach the 2 longer pieces together. After the piece was built, I did go back and added 2 more brads to each piece to make sure this is going to hold up. I saw this on Pinterest as a towel holder, and I'll show you how that looks, but I had the idea to use this to hold all of my vinyl in my craft room, so there are multiple ways you could use something like this to organize areas of your home. For this Anthropologie dupe, I'm using a Dollar Tree basket, and I'm only using this basket for the shape. If you had something similar, it would work because next I'm going to cover the basket with canvas drop cloth fabric. I picked this up from Home Depot just to have it on hand. They carry several different sizes for as low as $10. I covered the basket in 2 layers of the drop cloth, and the first layer I cut pretty close to the same size of the basket and wanted to cover up the handles as well. I wasn't going to paint the basket, but I did end up painting the inside and the bottom later on. It would definitely be easier to paint that before adding the fabric though. For the bottom, I cut slits into the fabric so it would mold around the curves with minimal wrinkles on the sides. Then I added a second layer, hot gluing it on top of the first, but I cut the second layer wider so that I could fold it over on the inside and have that canvas bag rim like the Anthropologie one. And I finished the bottom the same way as the first layer. So I covered up the handles, and I want there to be handles on this basket, so I took my scissors and cut a slit in the middle of where the handle is and then folded it inward so you don't see that plastic, and glued it down. Now I need to add the daisies. I did a few so I could figure out the best way to do this before showing you guys. I'm sure there's another way I could have done this, but I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. I took 4mm macrame cord, which I get from Amazon, and it's always linked in my description box, and I cut down 7 pieces. The length doesn't really matter here because we'll end up cutting them down more, but for the least amount of waste, I would cut them to about 3 inches. Then you want to pull the cords apart. The macrame is made up of 3 pieces twisted together, so I just untwisted them and I divided them into 2 piles of 10. To add the threads to the basket, I'm using yellow cotton twine. This is actually the colored twine that Dollar Tree had out last year, so it's pretty thick. And I took one group of 10 and added it horizontally, then added the second group of 10 vertically. Like I said, I'm sure there's a better way that I could have done this, but I just couldn't figure out how. Then I wrapped the center with the thread a few times and kind of fanned out the macrame as I went so it would start creating I finished it off with a vertical line of thread on both sides, and then it tied off the thread inside the basket and cut it off. Next, I cut off all of the excess macrame and shaped the flower. I repeated this several times around the basket, but I won't bore you with all of that, so let's take a look at the numbers. The Anthropologie version cost $34. I had all of these materials on hand, but you could find everything you needed at the Dollar Tree.
Is inspired by a few different floral pieces I've seen. I'm using another 12 by 12 canvas and these lavender floral picks that I got from Hobby Lobby. These florals weren't too expensive like some can be at Hobby Lobby. They were $4.99 a piece, so when you get them on a half off day, that's not too bad. These were the exact silhouette I was looking for this project. So I cut the stems down into individual pieces. That way I could lay them out how I wanted. Once I had all the lavender laid out how I wanted, I glued the florals down with my Starbond super glue. I didn't want to use hot glue because I thought you would end up seeing that in the end, which isn't what I wanted. This part does take a little bit of time, but I didn't glue every little piece down, just enough so that it would stay in place. Next, I added some of the grass pieces along the bottom for some more dimension. Initially, I wanted this to be coated in plaster, but the more I thought about it, I thought the plaster would end up looking like a mess. Really, all I wanted was the whole piece to be one color, so I decided to spray paint it instead. I used the color Heirloom White, which is a warm, creamy off-white color. I had to give the florals several coats. The paint absorbs into the material of the florals, and I feel like it still could use another coat or two. But that's it for this one. It was pretty easy.
This is what my inspiration was. So it's like this shell decor modern stand thing. And I am going to take some foam core board, trace a large circle, and cut this out.
So when cutting out foam core board, you want to make sure you have a very sharp knife so that you don't get any wonky, jaggedy edges and that it's nice and smooth. Then I'm going to take a smaller object and do the same thing, cutting out our smaller circle. Next, I'm taking this icing cake decorating kit that I have, and I'm going to take my piping bag because this is what we're going to use to get all of our little circles onto our foam core board. So during my bathroom renovation, my husband bought this giant thing of joint compound and we didn't even use half of it. So I figured, why not come up with some DIYs that I can create using the leftover joint compound? And I have to give a shout out to my friend Brandy at the DIY Struggle because she has a whole video on ways that you can use joint compound to create texture on different materials, and it is awesome. So I'm gonna link it for you down below. Make sure you check that out because she totally inspired this idea. So next I'm taking my piping bag and we're just going to create the center part just like our inspiration had. So I just put some globs on there and then smoothed it down with my plastic little spatula here. And then I'm gonna take a comb, just like a hair comb, and that's how I'm gonna get those little lines that you saw in the inspiration image. This worked out perfect. So next I want to create the little circles, and on the inspiration, that one was made out of seashells. I'm assuming it just said shells, so I would imagine those are seashells, but I didn't have seashells and this is what I wanted to use anyways. So I just created varying sizes of circles, some smaller, some medium, some larger, and I just filled it all the way around my circle on both sides. And then I had to let that sit around to dry for about a day, I would say it took for this piece to dry. Next, we're going to make our base. I'm taking one of these MDF signs that you can find at the Dollar Tree along with one of their larger dowel rods. And I'm going to paint both of these black. I also cut down, clearly you can see I cut down that board to make it a little smaller. Next I need to find the center of my board and we're going to drill a little hole so that I can put my dowel rod in there and make it nice and secure. Of course I got to clean up my space. I love this little vacuum. I will link it down below. It is from Amazon. Then I'm going to take some wood glue, stick my dowel in there and set it down to dry. So once my sculpture piece is dried, I'm taking a sanding block and just making sure there's no really rough spots, and this stuff is really easy to sand so you can mold it to be however you want. Then I'm going to take my ivory chalk paint and I'm going to paint everything all over. I did the front and the back, and I went in all kinds of different directions to make sure I got into all those little grooves and spaces. Then I'm going to take my mineral chalk paint, and this is a stencil brush from Target actually, but I love this thing because it's so frayed that it's perfect for distressing something like this. So I just went back and forth with my mineral and my ivory until I got the look that I wanted. The last little step here is to take our hot glue and attach the foam core joint compound board sculpture to the base. And that's it for this one. This was super easy. So the inspiration cost $60 and mine was free because I had all of these materials on hand. Now mine does look a little bit different, but I used colors that would fit my home decor style. You could use your imagination with this. You could do so many different things. Make it blue if you wanted to. Make a different design. There are so many ways you could make this your own.
This project, I'm making a geometric wood art piece. You can find these all over Pinterest right now, so I took inspiration from different ones that I liked and started drawing out the design. Alright, so I built this frame. It's about 28 inches long, 1 foot wide. And I just built it out of MDF boards that are this thickness 1x2, just like the wood that you can get from the Dollar Tree. So this is the 10-inch piece of wood that I got from Dollar Tree, cut down the Home Depot pieces that I got and made them all 10 inches, the exact same size. So that's what we're going to be working with, is only this size and then cutting it down. This is going to have a diamond type pattern, and the center of all of my boards will be cut at 90 degrees. You can cut this angle with a miter box or a saw, whichever you have.
I decided to cut all of my angles before laying out the pattern. Cut down all of my wood. So I started out with these 10-inch pieces from the Dollar Tree. So right there, that's $16 if you wanted to get this from the Dollar Tree, or probably about $4 from Home Depot. And then I cut 45-degree angles on all of them because we're gonna start putting them together. The only cuts needed for this project are straight cuts and 45-degree angles. And to build the pattern, I started laying out the wood pieces with the 45-degree angles together, forming a point, and lined up 4 sets, one in front of the other. I did lay a scrap piece down in the middle so my wood didn't just fall while I was laying out my pattern. With the 4 sets laid out facing down, I'm going to do the same thing facing up, and the bottoms will start overlapping, as this is where I'm going to make another straight cut. When I was happy with where the spacing in the middle is, I drew a line and cut these pieces down. Now you can start to see the pattern coming together. This is a symmetrical design, so both the top and bottom will be cut the same way. Once both sides are cut down, here's what it should look like. We aren't quite done yet though. Next, I took the frame and laid it down on top of the pattern this time. This way I can draw a line and know exactly where to cut so the shape fits perfectly inside my frame. I also numbered each piece so I knew where it belonged. This cut is going to be a 45-degree angle, so you should end up with 8 pieces that have a 45-degree angle and a straight cut, and then 8 pieces with 2 45-degree angles in opposite directions. This is what everything should look like all cut. I took a fine grit sandpaper to go over all of the cut edges and made sure they were nice and smooth. And now it's time to paint. I'm using fawn as the main color and creating an ombre using white and black. And the way these are painted is what will bring that design to life. So starting with fawn by itself, I painted what will be the second row from the bottom and then the third row from the top. The next section, I added some white to lighten the color, and then again added more white until it was a very pale beige, and again working my way around the pattern. Adding the black was very tricky. Instead of making the fawn color deeper, which is what I wanted, it turned out to be a charcoal-like color, and I ended up playing with this one a lot until I was somewhat happy with it. I do wish it was more of a deeper brown tone, but I couldn't figure out how to get that to work with the tone of the rest of this piece. For the background, my husband helped me cut a piece of plywood, and I painted the top half of it and then that center square white and then the bottom black, adding to the ombre vibe. All that's left to do is glue everything together, and for this I used my wood glue hot glue so it would dry quickly. What do you guys think of this? I absolutely love the way this turned out. I need a better vocabulary than to always saying I absolutely loved it.
I found this beautiful handcrafted brass heart sculpture on the Pottery Barn site and thought it would be a fun challenge to see if I could create something similar. Now, I'm not going to use real brass for my piece, but instead I'm using wire and clay. This is 16 gauge wire, and again, I brought the image up on my phone so I could follow the same shape. I used about 60 inches of the wire and bent it until I was happy with how it was looking. This was a little difficult because the sculpture was made from one piece and molded into the 2 hearts. So I shaped one heart and then a second slightly larger while using my needle nose pliers to help shape it. Then I wrapped the end of the wire around the start of the hearts. Next, I got out my Craftsmart polymer clay. You can get this brand at Michael's, but any brand will work. I would actually suggest using a darker color clay, preferably black, but didn't think about that at first. I conditioned and warmed up the clay by rolling it out and folding it several times. This takes a little bit of time until the clay is workable, and then I rolled it out into a long snake and started to mold it around the wire. The more you work with the clay, the warmer it gets, which makes shaping it become a little bit difficult. You can put the piece in the fridge or freezer for a few minutes to stiffen the clay back up a little bit if it becomes too hard to work with. I should have done that because by the end the clay was so bendable that you could see a lot of dents and bumps in the piece from where I was holding it. But that's okay, it just has a real handmade look, which is what I was going for. Once the clay was wrapped around the wire, I did my best to smooth it out and hide any seams, and then I put it into the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. Then you want to turn the oven off and leave the piece inside to slowly cool down. I left it in the oven overnight since it was later in the day anyways. Here's how it looks the next day, and now I'm going to spray paint it black, but if you use black clay, this step wouldn't be necessary. Now to make it look like brass, I'm taking my Rub and Buff in the color Gold Leaf. This is such a cool and unique product, and a little bit goes such a long way, but it does dry down pretty quickly. So I found it was easier to squeeze the tube and dab my brush into the tube rather than put some out on my work surface. You want to make sure you really buff and work the wax into the surface of your project. I used 2 different makeup brushes because they have soft bristles but are still firm. So I used one to apply the product and one to really buff it out. I ended up adding 2.5 layers of the Rub and Buff on top. I had wanted to use 2 different gold colors, but unfortunately the European gold one that I ordered didn't come in time for this video. But I plan on using this technique on my kitchen makeover and want to use the 2 colors on my drawer pulls and sink faucet. Those videos will be coming up soon. For the base of my sculpture, I had these Dollar Tree foam dice and glued 2 of them together and then painted them black. Now to attach the sculpture on top, I simply used hot glue. A stronger adhesive would probably be better, but this worked well for me, and that's it for this one. Again, I had all these supplies already on hand, and the Pottery Barn version cost $129. I think this turned out pretty darn good, but what do you think? Would you attempt to make a sculptural piece like this? This one was inspired by this beautiful clay bowl I found while scrolling through Pinterest, and I'm using the polymer clay for this one. I'm not sure if this technique I'm going to show you would work with air dry clay though. I start making a big cylinder of white clay. Then I'm using this Sculpey clay in the color copper and rolling it out into a thin sheet. To get that colored edge around each clay circle on the bowl, you want to cover the white cylinder with the copper or whatever colors that you choose. When you're working with this type of clay, it gets really warm, and the warmer it is, the more bendable and moldable it is. So I'm going to need to cut this cylinder down, but first I'm going to put it in the freezer for 15 minutes. That will firm up the clay a bit and make it much easier to cut into while keeping its shape. When I took the clay out of the freezer, now I can start cutting it into thin slices to create the circles. Here you can see how each little circle will have that copper outline around it. If the clay starts getting too warm before you're done cutting it, just throw it back in the freezer for a few minutes, then keep going. Once I have all of the circles cut, I want to add texture to them. So to do that, I'm taking a little scrap of burlap and lightly roll it over the pieces. Don't press too hard, but hard enough to see the lines. Next, to make the shape, I grabbed a kitchen bowl and started adding the circles to it. When you add the circles on the bottom, it's no longer going to be flat. So to get a flat surface for the bowl to sit right on a table, I take my rolling pin again and roll over the circles on the bowl. very lightly. Again, I don't want to distort the shape, I just want to make the bottom flat. Then continue adding the circles on around the sides of the bowl. When they were all on, I put it in the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes and then turned my oven off and let it cool down. I didn't think there was enough circles going up the sides of the bowl, so I made another log cylinder and cut out more to add on and then put it back in the oven.
Saw this wall art piece at Hobby Lobby and thought it would be pretty easy to recreate. First, I picked up a 100 count box of dowels from Michael's. I wasn't sure how many I would need and thought this was a cheaper option than buying several smaller packages. In the end, I had more than half of the box left over. The Hobby Lobby version had 35 dowels on it, so I counted that many out. However, I think I spaced mine out further and didn't use that many. I recently picked up this Dark and Decrepit from DIY Paint, and it's kind of like a gel stain. So I used a baby wipe and applied it all over the dowels. I wasn't sure what this color was going to look like when I bought it, but it's pretty dark and more rustic looking than the Hobby Lobby piece. But I kept going and decided to create a second one using a different stain. For the second one, I'm using Golden Oak, which is a much better match. Alright, while the stain dries, I prep the canvases. I happen to have two old 12 by 12 canvases that my son and I drew on a while back and we no longer needed. So I'm going to remove that canvas from the frame. I did hold on to those drawings, but I used a small chisel to pry the staples up and remove them. Then I removed the canvas portion and stained the frames using those same colors. Now for the fun part, I'm using miter shears to cut the dowels down to size. The center piece needs to have a point at the end since it's going into that corner. So I cut a tiny angle in both directions off. However, this first dowel isn't quite long enough to span that full frame length, so I cut down a second dowel to fill in the gap. Then I used my wood glue super glue to attach the dowels. For the rest of the pieces in this layer, I cut a 45-degree angle on either end of the dowel and spaced them out as evenly as I could, just eyeballing it. Then I let this layer dry for about an hour before adding the next section.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. Oh, the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright. Oh, you and I, we got it. We don't need no
I repeated the same process and cut 45-degree angles on the dowels and then added them to the frame going the opposite direction. This time you don't add them all the way across the frame. There are two spots that will be empty to create the design. On this darker version, I spaced the dowels on the top layer a little closer for that middle section so that there would be a larger gap on either side of it. You'll see what I mean here in a minute. I had to add 2 dowels together for 3 of the middle dowels this time since I put them closer together.
I was at the wrong place at the right time, 'cause suddenly there you were with those bright blue eyes. We were conversing under the night sky, when you took my hand, said let's leave now. Don't wanna be shy, I will let my guard down. Don't wanna be shy, I will let my guard down.
Let me know what you think about these wall art pieces. I haven't done anything like this on my channel, but I have more ideas to share if this is something you want to see. Love this planter, how it looks like a basket and that two-tone color of it. It fits right into my aesthetic and is so easy to recreate. I bet you're thinking I would use the brown nautical rope or thick jute twine, but no. I remember I had these tan mesh tube ribbons from the Dollar Tree, and I like the look of this much better. I am using the white nautical rope, and you can certainly use jute twine or the brown nautical rope if you decide to recreate this for yourself. For the nautical rope, I untwisted so I have 3 individual strands. This is going to give it less of a coastal look and a little more boho or contemporary look. It also helps the cohesion with the mesh tube. I had this plastic planner in my stash and it was the size I wanted. Of course, the larger size base you use, the more rope you're going to need. I thought this was going to end up using a lot more rope than it did, but I'm starting out with the mesh tubing on the bottom of the planter, and I'm using hot glue to attach it. I don't think a stronger adhesive is necessary here unless you will be putting this outside in the heat, then you might risk that hot glue melting. So like I said, I thought I would use a lot more rope than I did, and I was worried I would run out of the mesh tubing. I had 4 new packages and 1 open that I had used half of on another project. So as I was gluing it down, I pulled on the mesh a little bit to flatten out the tube. This made it stretch and go a little bit further. When I got to the end of each strand of the mesh tube, it was really easy to attach the next one. They blended right into each other seamlessly and you can't even tell. That's not exactly the case for the nautical rope. I went a little less than halfway up the planter with the mesh tube before switching over to the white rope. Now the white rope is made up of a ton of individual strings, so you can't just glue down the bottom and leave it. You need to glue all of those strings together so nothing unravels in the back. I also made sure to start and end each section in the same spot so this can be the back. When I got to the top, I'm adding in some handles like the Pottery Barn version had. I just let the rope droop and then glued it again a few inches over. I did a handle on each side of the basket and then I went around them twice. So it wasn't just one strand of the rope and had a little bit more substance to it. I glued the 2 strands of the handles together. Then to finish off the rope, I glued 1 row on the inside and then ended the rope kind of under the lip of the basket. This was a super easy project. I then took out one of my plants that fit inside of the basket and put it out on display. first project, I'm taking some scrap plywood that I had left over from my living room transformation, along with some nails that I got from Walmart. I grabbed 2 packs, but only ended up using less than 1, and I'm gonna make some string art. So I just cut out like a feather shape from computer paper, but it wasn't quite big enough. So I just flipped it upside down, how you can see here, to get the long shape that I wanted. And then I just nailed in all of my nails using the paper as my guide for the outline. Then I'm gonna take this embroidery floss I got from Amazon. I will link it below. I'm using black and then a color called Golden Coffee. And I'm just going to make a loop, tie it around this first nail that I want to use as my starting point. And then I'm going to just like make a figure 8 shape kind of. So you'll see here what I'm doing, but I'm just wrapping it around each nail and then like crossing over, wrapping around again. So I did that about 3 times on each nail section so that it would make the embroidery floss look a little bit thicker. Now the key here, this is the first time I've made string art, so it was a learning process for me, but you want to make sure you're like pulling that string tight and also keeping your finger on the previous section that you just did, because so often that string would just slide right off of the previous nail and unravel everything I had just done. So you definitely want to make sure you're holding it down in place while you go. I was wondering, whenever you see the inspiration piece, the black feather parts are like a solid black and more filled in. So I'm wondering, I'd like your guys' opinion in the comments if I should have filled in the whole black feather. I do end up giving it just like the like stem feather details inside, but I don't fill it all the way through. And I think it would have turned out a little bit better. It would have made that like brown gold coffee color pop against the black a lot more if I had filled it in. So I might go back and change that, but we'll see. I do still love the way it turned out. Once I get to the end, I'm just gonna loop it again around that nail and tie another knot. So I do another double knot and then trim off the ends. I do end up hot gluing, just putting like the tiniest little dab of hot glue on the ends just to make sure you can't see where I cut these strings off. And then I realized I think I should have put the nails a little closer together, especially if I was going to want to fill in this whole piece. But to get that like center, I don't know what you want to call those, like the center branch parts, I don't know. I ended up going back in and adding some more nails up the center so that I could then make that like V shape, and you'll see that here in a second. So here I am creating those V's, so that's why I put the nails in the center as well, so I would have a point to string those on and create more of a shape. But I do still think I should have filled in the black all the way, and it would have looked really cool, but we'll see if I end up changing that or not. And again, I'm just using that like figure 8 pattern going back and forth around my nails. Another thing I want to say, whenever you're doing this, you don't want to pull too much of your string off of the spool because it just gets like tangled up and twisted and knotted. You can kind of see off to the side there. If you pull too much off at a time, it just creates a huge knot. So now I'm going to go in with the golden coffee color, and we're going to do the same thing. I did 4 of my feathers in black, and I am doing 3 of them in gold. I didn't want it to be too symmetrical or have like an even number of feathers. I don't know. I just like things like this to be in an odd number. I'm just doing the same thing here, twisting around the outside, and you can see I created kind of like some triangle patterns in the black
feathers, and I do something a little bit different here with the gold ones. When I did the gold, I did learn my lesson to not pull so much string, thread, embroidery floss. I don't know, so many different things you can call it. I didn't pull off too much at a time. I just unraveled it as I went. And then again, I'm going to add that center part so we can create the design in the gold feathers. And I was a lot more, I thought about where I needed to place those nails a lot better when I went in with the gold and wanted to create just that V shape. I didn't add any of the little triangles in here. I wanted them both to be different. When I created this part, wow, I'm having so much trouble with this string. It just keeps unraveling on me. But anyways, when I'm going up to the next section, so I'm doing my like sides that go off to the right and the left, and then I come back to the center, and then I go up to the next nail on top of it, and then go out to the right and the left again to create that V shape. Then I come back to the center, go to the next one above it, and that's how I got that pattern to work. The last thing I wanted to do was just take this like metallic bronze color marker and color on all of the nail heads. I had wanted to use bronze and black nails to do this project, but I couldn't find them. I only could find silver, and it was just really standing out to me against like the yarn and the wood, so I didn't like that. But my inspiration piece cost only about $30. It was from Home Goods. It wasn't too bad, but mine only cost about $10 for the nails and for the embroidery floss. And I really do love the way this turned out. I just think it would have popped even more with the black filled in. So let me know what you guys think. I'm duping one of the metal word signs from Magnolia, and I'm taking these skewer sticks from the Dollar Tree. They're the small ones that are out all year long, and I'm going to start measuring them out to the size I want my letters to be. I started with one of the E's because I thought that would be the easiest letter for me to gauge how tall I wanted them to be. The vertical line of my E is 3 inches tall, and the horizontal lines are 2 inches. Once I had the skewers cut, I'm using my Starbond super glue with the accelerator to attach them together. I thought this glue would work the best with how tiny these skewers are and give that immediate hold once you spray the accelerator. I do have this product linked in my description box if you're interested. I continue to do this for all of my letters, cutting them down and gluing together until it spelled out peace. Once I had all of my letters, I'm taking 7 tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree and gluing them in a line. Then I glued the letters on top of the blocks. All that's left to do now is paint this to look like metal using Rust-Oleum hammered black spray paint. Now let's take a look at how mine compares to Magnolia. I had the supplies already on hand, but if you had to buy them, this would cost $2. The Magnolia version is 9 inches tall. I probably should have checked that before making mine, so mine could have been a little bit taller, but I still think it looks pretty close. But what do you guys think?
Next up, I found these textured candles and diffuser set, and we all know I love textures. Now, I'm not going to make this whole set, I'm just taking inspiration from it. At first, I had the idea to wrap clay around a vase and then carve into the clay, but clay shrinks as it dries. That would have caused a lot of cracking. So instead, I decided to create the whole thing solely out of clay. I bought this 10-pound box of clay last summer and still had plenty left to work with. I rolled a chunk out into a slab and used these decorative molding pieces that I had to keep the clay the same width. Then I cut out 6 pieces, 2 5 by 5 inch squares and 4 1.5 by 5 inch rectangles. I built my bud vase, adding 2 of the rectangle sides onto the square front. When you connect pieces of clay together, you want to score and slip it so they have a strong bond and don't crack apart as they dry. So I scored the edge of both pieces being connected and added some slip, which is clay mixed with water. This acts as a glue. I realized my slip is a different color. I had grabbed the wrong one by accident, but that's okay, you don't even see it in the end. Then when you have this side together, you also need to blend out the seam where they meet. So I was taking a clay tool and pushing the clay up and down between the 2 pieces until there was no seam and the side was smooth. I did the same process to apply the second square side, but because the clay is super wet and moldable at this point, I needed to put something inside to hold it up. This 2x4 wood piece was almost the perfect depth, so I used this. I know I'm kind of flying through this part, but that's because I'm no expert when it comes to creating ceramics or clay vessels, and I don't think you guys are interested in an in-depth tutorial here. I let the clay dry for a bit until it would stand on its own and not collapse. And then I removed the block and added an opening for the neck of the bud vase. Alright, now that this is built, I let it dry for several days. It was probably a week before I came back to it. Next, I painted the whole thing black and gave it 2 coats. I'm using DIY paint in black velvet here, but you could use any color and any brand, that part doesn't matter. The only thing I would keep in mind here is we're going to scratch the surface to reveal the clay underneath. This is a terracotta clay, so I made sure I would like the 2 colors together. It didn't take long at all for the paint to dry against the clay. Then I got out some more of my clay tools to start carving the paint away and revealing that clay underneath. I went back and forth using a few different clay tools to do this. I didn't want a super uniform and perfect look, and the different tools gave slightly different results. The one tool would take a larger chunk out of the clay and combine 2 of my lines that I was adding, and I actually liked how that looked and wanted it to be sporadic all over the piece. I etched the bud vase around the front and the 2 sides. Ideally, I would do the back as well, but this took such a long time to do it, and my hand was really cramping up, so I ignored the back today. But I really love how this piece turned out, even more so that I created the whole thing from scratch. I am recreating this Urban Outfitters metal wall decor planter for just a few dollars. I'm starting out with this Dollar Tree metal faux galvanized planter, and I tried to use some acetone to remove those letters. I swear I have seen other content creators remove the letters from this galvanized planter. I was not having any luck with the acetone. So then I grabbed my Dollar Tree scraper and tried to scrape off the letters. Honestly, don't even waste your time because those words are actually like raised on the surface of the planter and they're not coming off. So I did end up removing the black part of it,
but the letters themselves are still there. In the end, I just took some sandpaper and I scraped off the black part of the letters that way, and that worked out much better, much easier. So if you decide to do this, I would go that direction. Next, we're gonna start painting, and I want to use a sponge for this method. So I'm taking some water in a little bowl and then a little cut up piece of sponge, and I'm just gonna get it completely soaking wet, wring it out, and then we're gonna start dabbing on our paint onto the planter. The first color that I am using is by Folk Art in the color Cinnamon. I really love this color when I want to do any type of like faux rust or metal type of look, and I'm going for like a rusted copper look on this piece, which is similar to how the original inspiration is. And I did dry using my heat tool in between each color of paint that I added. The next color we're using is Apple Barrel in Burnt Umber. I had started out using this color just around the edges and then like the seams on the sides, but I did end up going over the entire piece with this color. I also thought I went a little bit too heavy-handed with that, so I went back over with the Cinnamon again to get that lightness to come through. And I just kept playing around with the layers, adding the dark and the light where I thought it was needed. Next, I'm taking this metallic Rust-Oleum spray paint in the color Antique Brass, and I'm going to just lightly mist this over top of the piece. I don't want it to be fully covered in this color spray paint. I just want to hit it in some spots just to give that metallic and more metal-like finish. Once that dried, I'm coming back inside and using the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Tuscan Red. This one, I didn't end up mixing the colors completely, like in the bottle, it had kind of separated. So it was looking very purple when I first started applying it, and then I realized I really didn't mix it up well enough because it should be more of like a deep burgundy, perfect rust color. So once I realized that, I did go back over it. And then once that dried, I went in with my like sponge brush. I forget what these things are called. You know what I'm talking about. And I just like deepened up around the edges and the seams to give that like authentic look. Now for the backer that's going to hang on the wall, I'm just taking some foam core board and I'm gonna cut it to the size that I am happy with. Mine ended up being a little bit taller than the inspiration, but that is fine. And then I'm going to just kind of angle those corners so that it's a little bit more, it was like an odd shape, the inspiration piece, which you'll see in the end, but I just took my X-Acto knife and played around with the corners until I was happy with that look. Next, I'm taking some scrap leather that I have. This part isn't really necessary. I just thought that adding that texture that the leather has on the background would just help it to kind of give a different look from that metal planter part. Then I'm taking that same spray paint, and this time I am covering the whole leather fabric swatch with that, and I'm gonna have this as like my underneath color. And then I'm taking the exact same colors that we used on the metal planter to get that same look, but only using my sponge brush here on this one because I wanted it to be a little bit more streaky, which is also how that inspiration piece was. Next, we need to attach that leather to our foam core board. I use decoupage glue here. You could use Mod Podge, you could use a spray adhesive, whatever you are happy using. And then I just laid my fabric down on top of that board, making sure that it did come up around all of the edges a little bit because I wanted to wrap it around the sides. And to do that, I just used my Starbond super glue with the accelerator because the fabric is a little bit thicker and stiffer, so it would stay in place. Then I just cut off any of the excess fabric. To attach the planter, I had to add some of these popsicle sticks because of the lip on that metal planter itself. It wasn't going to touch that fabric or the foam core background, so that's why I added the popsicle stick so it would have something to adhere to. And then to attach the planter, I'm using both E6000 and my hot glue for that short-term, long-term hold. Don't mix them. You can see I put separate dots of each.
Then I added my planter down on top. Now I did add a little like 3-pound dumbbell weight to this overnight so that it would stay in place and it would be nice and secure to my backer. Next, I am taking this little screw that was just laying around in my garage, and I'm going to place it in my vise because I only want the head of the screw, and I'm going to saw it off. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Angela, what if we do not have a beautiful vise like you do? What else can we do? Don't worry, I got you. You can use a miter box like you see me doing here as well. This was a little bit more difficult. It was hard to hold that screw, but it still worked. Next, I'm just attaching those screw heads. You could also use like furniture tacks or thumbtacks. It doesn't have to be a screw for this part. And then I just attached it with my E6000, added a jute twine hanger to the back, and that was it for this one. So let's see what the original cost, $29. Mine was about $2 to make. If you had to buy all of those supplies, it might cost you about $5. I had a lot of it already on hand. But let me know how you think I did compared to the original. I also didn't show it, but I did end up going back and doing the inside of the planter with that same paint finish that we did on the rest of it so that you wouldn't see that silver metal peeking out. Next up, this project took me a really long time to create, and I had a few ideas on how I could have made it easier in case you want to recreate this. I'm taking this tomato garden stake, and I think this is where I went wrong. I'm making a woven basket, and because this has the circle rings to hold the shape, I had to cut each row of twine and add them individually. If I was recreating this, I would add sturdy wire like this 16 gauge rebar around a circle base. That way you can continue looping the twine around continuously. Lessons learned. But I wanted more than just the 3 vertical points that the tomato stake had, so I added 15 more using the rebar wire and my favorite Starbond superglue to secure them in place. Next, I'm taking some jute twine and adding it on top of all the vertical wires to cover them up. I found this massive spool of twine at one of my local thrift stores, such a great find, and I left some twine longer at the bottoms so I can curl them under. Once I have all of the wires covered, I'm going to start weaving the basket. Like I said earlier, because of the metal rings, I had to cut each strand of twine individually, which made this project take hours longer than it needed to. So I chose one section that I wanted to be the back and made sure I started and ended each piece in the same spot to be the back. This bottom section is going to have a basic weave pattern going over, under, over, under, over, under each wire, and the next strand right on top of that going under, over, and I added 8 rows like this. Next, I'm going to leave a little gap and then add 2 rows of twine going in the same pattern over, under, and continue up the basket, leaving space between each row on this section. I wish I had put the rows a little bit closer together for this bottom. 6 rows like this, and then decided I didn't like the look of just one vertical twine per section, so I went back and added a second right next to it. I think this looks much better with the doubled up rows I just added. Then I went back to the single alternating rows close together and added 9 rows like this and repeated the pattern all the way up the back. I wanted the top to start tapering in, so I took my wire cutters and cut off that remaining top metal ring. This was pretty difficult since I have no hand strength, but once I got it off, I bent the wires inward, creating that tapered look and continued.
The top, I bent the wires straight up to create the mouth of the basket and added the remaining twine section. To finish the top, I bent the wires all the way in and hot glued the top 2 rows in place. To clean up the hot glue strings all over the twine, I took my heat gun to the basket and melted them in, and then I took a lighter to the whole thing. This part I was a little bit nervous about since it was such a large piece. A few parts did catch on fire, but I quickly put them out and it was fine. I wish I would have left the basket in this natural twine, but the Anthropologie versions were painted or they had used colored wicker. Either way, I ended up spray painting the basket black, but I didn't like how the black looked at all. It was way too dark. You couldn't see any of the basket detail. So I went back over it in the color smoky beige. Walmart has been sold out of all their spray paints for months, but when I was looking for colors for this video, they were fully stocked. If your stores have been sold out recently, check back and see if they're in stock now. They had so many great neutral colors this past week. Let me know what you think about this one. My version cost about $25 with the thrifted twine, wire, and spray paint, compared to Anthropologie at $158 for the large version, which is 24 inches, and mine came in at 23 1/4, so very close. This was a very time-consuming project because I had to keep cutting the twine. I think it took me about 8 hours to complete. I would like to try another basket where I can use one continuous piece in a future video. I've seen a lot of iterations of wall pockets floating around YouTube lately and wanted to try one using clay. I bought this big box of natural clay from Michael's. It was only $13.99 for this 10-pound box, and they have deals pretty often to make it even cheaper. I haven't worked with a natural clay before, and this says it's an air dry clay, not oven bake, so I started working with it like I would any other air dry clay. You can see when I opened it, the clay is very wet. There was water on the plastic. That was a little concerning. I thought maybe this isn't gonna go so well. But I continued because I love testing out new products and things I've never done before to share my experience with you guys so you don't waste your money on something that isn't quite what you thought it would be. When I rolled the clay out on my acrylic mat, it was just stuck to the surface, like the water had suctioned it down. So I tried to sprinkle some cornstarch down. That didn't work. You need to use parchment paper or wax paper to use a clay like this. And I rolled it out into a kind of an ovalish shape. Then using a tissue blade, I cut down 3 of the sides to make them straight. I wanted to add some texture to the clay and have this texture mat. It's double-sided and it came in a pack of 3 with different designs on it, also from Michael's. I'm using the Stone Lake side for the background of this pocket. Then I'm adding a hole to the top to hang it, just using the handle of a paintbrush. Now for the pocket portion, I made a rectangle, and this part was a little tricky. When you add 2 pieces of clay together, you need to score the parts. So I did that, but this clay being so wet to start, it was really difficult to work with. I also needed to put something in between the 2 layers to hold the pocket piece up while it dries. I tried using small paint bottles, but didn't like that there was a dip in the middle. They were also a little too tall and the clay wasn't reaching the sides. So I got a paper towel roll and that worked much better. I squished it down a little so it wasn't so round, and then I blended the sides in using water to help shape the clay and make it all one piece. Like I said, this clay was not easy to work with. I spent a lot of time working at this, trying to make it look nice, and it was starting to crack in some spots, but eventually I just set it aside to dry. I actually like the way the pocket turned out though, with this little ripple on it. Now, me being the perfectionist that I am, I had to try this again with a different clay and a different method. So I got out my DAS air dry clay and rolled out a long rectangle. To keep it all the same thickness, I'm using a stack of 3 large craft sticks on either side. This time I used my L roller to help cut the edges. I also did some searching to see what people use to keep the pocket open and saw several videos where they use a foam piece. So I cut down a little styrofoam rectangle and that was perfect.
This time I also made the pocket out of one solid piece instead of cutting the back and then adding on the front pocket. This method was so much easier, and I did the same thing blending the sides together. To decorate this one, I got out my olive crest mold from IOD and used a few of the filigree pieces, then added them to the pocket and used water to smooth out any areas that were starting to show some cracks. I let the clay dry and it took about 48 hours. Then I painted the decorative one in plaster by Waverly. This color is very close to the color of the clay, but I wanted to fill in some of those small cracks that had formed. And last, I'm taking my bronze gilding wax to bring out those details. If you don't have gilding wax, you can use any type of wax or even dry brush with any color that fits your style. Easy project. I just love these fuzzy little heart-shaped pillows, and throw pillows are an easy way to add a touch of the holiday without going overboard. I took a trip to Joann Fabrics to see what I could find for the pillows. They have tons of options to choose from. This terry cloth would be nice if you don't want a high pile fabric. Or you could go for a more velvety option with this short pile fur. And right as I was about to settle on that one, there it was. Look at all those beautiful textures and furs. That's the one. It's a faux shearling and looks pretty darn close to the Pottery Barn version. Isn't it stunning? And I love how the shearling is only on one side. While I was waiting for the girl to cut the fabric, there was a basket of this E6000 fabric fusion glue. I've never seen this before, but I love E6000 and thought we should give it a try. Now, to make the pillow, I grabbed a Dollar Tree heart-shaped sign to use as a template, but I wanted the pillow to be a little bit bigger than the sign. So I used my fabric roller and marked out an additional 2 inches and then drew a line and cut out my heart. Next, I pinned the heart to another section of the fabric to make sure I cut them both the same size. So I didn't think the V in the middle of the heart was quite deep enough. I thought by the time I turned the pillow inside out, you wouldn't be able to tell it's a heart, so I cut the V a little bit deeper. But I think if I had left it, it would have looked a little bit more like the Pottery Barn one. Now we can use the fabric glue to attach the 2 sides. The instructions say to add the glue to both sides and then join them together. So I added a line of glue about 1/4 inch in from the edge on both hearts. You want to make sure you leave a section with no glue to turn it inside out later. I forgot about that part at first and had to wipe some of that glue off. Then you want to set it aside to dry for at least 8 hours. Let me tell you, I was pleasantly surprised at how strong this glue was when I tried to pull it apart the next day. Well, maybe I shouldn't say I was surprised because E6000 is a wonderful adhesive. I highly recommend this product if you need to attach fabric and don't have a sewing machine. Next, you want to turn the pillow right side out and then fill it with stuffing. I use polyfill and you can make it as full as you want. Just make sure you stuff it against all of the seams really well. Then you just need to seal up the opening. I folded the edges in a bit and used my hot glue to close it up. Now, because of the way this fabric is with the high pile and how I glued it rather than sewed it, the seams are not as fluffy. The glue was on top of that pile, so it just pulled at it when I flipped it inside out. But that's it for this pillow. However, I also wanted to show you that you can make this using Dollar Tree materials as well. I went to Dollar Tree looking for the fluffy white car towels, and of course my store didn't have any. I only had one at home, which wasn't enough for this project, but I actually think they stopped selling the white car towels and upgraded to these ShamWow looking ones. They probably work better on cars, but sad for us crafters. Anyways, I looked around and saw these fluffy white mop pads, so I grabbed 4 of them. I thought I could glue 2 together and then cut it out in the heart shape. Let me tell you, this stuff made an absolute mess. There were white strings all over me, all over the place after I cut it out, but I carried on and glued the 2 hearts together. This time I glued the back sides together because I figured these were so fluffy that they would hide the seam. But once the glue was dry and I started to stuff the little pillow, you could see the gaps between the fluffy sections. There was a hole at the top and a big gap where I had glued those 2 mop pads together. Now, I don't give up on projects easily, but I figured I already had 1 pillow and didn't need this one. But you could always use something else from the Dollar Tree, like their bathroom hand towels or bath mats, to get a similar look. So the Pottery Barn heart pillow cost about $50. My version cost $15 for the fabric and the glue.
Our next piece, I am taking these frame inspiration images, and I'm going to take some frames that I had laying around at home. This one is just blank, and then another one is a Marilyn Monroe film strip that my husband bought me while we were dating, and I thought I'd jazz it up a little bit. So I got these fat quarters from Walmart. They come in a pack of 5 and they're about $6. Such a great deal. So I'm going to use 1 blue set and 1 black and gold set for each of my frames. So I just took my L roller, whatever this is called, I forget the name of it, and I'm just going to make sure that I have enough fabric that it's going to fold all the way around my frame on like the inside, outside, and then like around to the back. So I use this as kind of like a guide for how big it needed to be and just cut out that piece. Then I cut out a center for the center of our picture frame, and I don't know if this was the best way to go about doing the center portion or not. Feel free to let me know if there would have been an easier option. I don't know how easy this was. I'm sure there was a better way to do it. But anyways, I'm taking some Mod Podge and I'm smothering it all over my frame everywhere that I want my fabric to lay so that it sticks nice and tight to the frame. And then I'm just going to rub everything down with the Mod Podge underneath, and you can kind of feel it start to come through. At the corners, I just kind of like pinched everything together till it came to a nice point, and I didn't do anything with the corners just yet. I actually did both of these frames a little bit different on the corners because I really wasn't sure what was going to work best. But I'll show you here in a second what I do on the black one. So I just got those corners nice and tight, and then I just cut them as close as I could and then made sure that the fabric laid flat. And you really couldn't tell that they were, I don't know, I guess it looked fine, I don't know. Anyways, then I'm taking my Mod Podge again and we're going all over the top of the fabric to make sure that it is nice and adhered to our frames. And that's it. This one was so easy, but such a beautiful upgrade to these frames and an easy way to get that look from the inspiration image.
And see how it looks?
Oh, it's a lot better than it did.
Yeah,
I like it.
Personality. I think it looks good.
You recording that?
Mm-hmm.
So needless to say, the hubby approved of this upgrade, and I said mine cost about $3 just in case you had to buy the fabric, but again, I had all of these materials on hand already. But I love the way this turned out. I think this blue one really gives off the same vibe as that tiled inspiration image.
Next up, we have this Koa cement planter. At $24, that's not a terrible price for a 4-inch planter pot, but we can make this for a whole lot less with supplies I already have on hand. The McGee & Co version also doesn't have a drainage hole, so it's just a cover pot. Here's the supplies I'm using to create the planter: a 4-inch nursery pot, white paint, plaster of Paris because I don't have any cement at the moment, and macrame cord. I started out painting the nursery pot by hand with a coat of gesso. Gesso is an acrylic paint primer. It helps paint stick to a more slick surface. I was gonna give the nursery pot a few coats of the gesso, but it was a little bit difficult to paint by hand because the pot is super flimsy. So instead I gave it one coat of the gesso and then I took it out to my garage to spray paint it. I'm currently out of white spray paint, so I used this tub and tile paint that the previous homeowner had left here. It's very old at this point, yet it still works okay, but the coverage isn't great. So for the third coat, I used my heirloom white spray paint. This step isn't entirely necessary. I wanted to make sure that you don't see that orange terracotta color underneath of the macrame and the plaster. Next, I'm gonna add the macrame cord all around the outside of the planter. This is a 3mm macrame cord. I would have preferred something thicker like the inspo image had. I think the Dollar Tree white nautical rope would have been a great alternative if you don't have macrame. The nautical rope would give you that chunkier look. Now, when you cut macrame, it tends to want to unravel. So to help that, I take the tip of my hot glue gun and I squeeze out just a tiny little amount of the glue onto the rope. Then I use the hot tip of the hot glue gun to spread the glue over the ends. This is going to cause them all to stick together, and once that glue dries, it becomes hard. So now they won't come unraveled. I also did not add hot glue to every inch of the nursery pot. I would wrap a little bit, add some glue, wrap a little more, add some glue, and so on. The plaster or the cement will help to hold everything in place later on. At the top, I went a little bit over the top of the nursery pot, that way you can't obviously see it. Then to end it, I cut the macrame cord and glued it down on the inside of the planter. Once there's a plant inside, you won't be able to see that end piece. And I do the same thing here at the top with the ends, gluing them in place so it doesn't fray. Next, for the plaster part, I'm mixing up 1 part of cold water to 2 parts of plaster in my silicone mixing cup. I used a half cup of water and 1 cup of plaster, and this was way too much. A 1/4 cup of water and a half a cup of plaster would have still been more than enough. But I love these silicone mixing cups because once you're done, just let the plaster dry. The dried plaster will easily pop out so the cups can be used over and over. The stir stick also wiggled right out as well. I always have these linked in my description box. Once the plaster is mixed up, you only have about 6 to 10 minutes to work with it before it starts to thicken and get hard. I'm using a sponge brush to apply the plaster all over the macrame cord. In the McGee & Co. inspo, it looked like there were areas where the cement covered the rope more than others. I tried to replicate that by building up the plaster in some sections. And that's it for this one. Add a plant to it, fake or real since we have those drainage holes. Came across these pillar candle holders while scrolling the site. It says they were new about a month ago, but I don't see them on the site anymore. Anyways, as I was looking at them, I was thinking I could easily recreate this shape using a styrofoam cone and a circle, which I already have in my stash. At first, I just glued the cone right down on the circle. However, I realized I wanted to cut the top of the cone off a little bit so there was more surface for that circle to sit on top. Now, I know some of you don't like when I share my mistakes or what I would do different. All I'll say is this is a DIY channel and DIY is not perfect. I will continue to share my trial and error process and being transparent in my videos to help those who do appreciate it from making the same mistakes as I have. Back to the DIY, since the Pottery Barn version is ceramic, I wanted to figure out how I could get the styrofoam to look smoother than it is. I had 2 different ideas to do this and used both since I'm creating 2 candle holders to see if one turns out better. On the taller one, I'm going to use plaster of Paris. I mixed up the powder and water using a 2-to-1 ratio until it was smooth. You only have a few minutes to work with this stuff, so I had to work pretty quickly. I thought I could get a smooth look by pouring it over the cone. This worked out pretty well. It is not perfectly smooth, but I was able to sand it down once it was dry. The second method I tried was joint compound. I didn't want to completely cover the cone with joint compound, but I added way too much at first. So I took my spatula and just kind of spread it over the surface to fill in all of those holes and removed all of the excess. Like I said, the plaster didn't turn out perfectly smooth, but it wasn't too bad. I sanded down both the plaster cone and the joint compound cone to get them smoother. Although you could also get a smooth surface by covering the cones with poster board and save yourself all of this time and effort. Next, I painted all of the pieces with white paint. Alright, now we can attach the circles back to the cones. I measured the sides this time to make sure I glue the cone down right in the center. Since this is a pillar candle holder, you want to make sure it's centered so the circle doesn't break off under the weight. Once I found the center, I marked it with a Sharpie and then I used my Star Bond super glue to attach the pieces together. This gives them a really secure hold. Now, to add the design, the Pottery Barn piece looked like watercolor, and I bought these watercolors from the Dollar Tree a while back. The blue in this kit wasn't the right shade that I was looking for, so I'm using another blue I had and mixed the black watercolor to get a deep blue. You want to add a lot of water to this paint to get that wash of color and not so saturated. Pro tip, if you need to add a straight line onto something, figure out how high you want that line to be. I'm using a paint container. And put your project on a turntable. Then you can hold your hand and the brush stationary and spin the object to get a perfect straight line. Then I added in the decorative pattern along the bottom. I like to use a pointed paintbrush here to get that variation in the lines a little bit easier. I'm not the best painter at things like this, but I just kept referencing the Pottery Barn version and did my best. Again, just make sure you have a lot of water in the paint, unless you want that more saturated look. I really like the uneven color. You could leave the candle holders just like this. They look beautiful, but the Pottery Barn version also had some paint splatter on them, which I wanted to add to mine as well. I wanted to make the blue darker for this part, so I added in even more black. But it doesn't look super different in the end. I wish it was a little bit darker. But I added even more water into the mix, and I used my finger to flick the watercolor onto the pieces. The additional water really helps it to flow off the brush nicely. Lastly, for this project, I wanted to get that high gloss finish, so I sprayed it with a satin sealer first. I didn't have a gloss spray sealer and didn't want the watercolor to smear if I had used a brush. But then I went back over top with a gloss Mod Podge. Up is this Malibu bowl I found scrolling on McGee & Co. for $128. I thought it was so cool looking and that I would be able to make it with clay that I already have. Mine doesn't turn out exactly the same, but let's get into it. I bought this 10-pound slab of clay about a year ago and was worried that it might be dried out by now since I haven't used it much. But to my surprise, it was still workable. So I cut off a chunk to start rolling it out and conditioning it. I do think it was a little bit drier than it used to be, which made it a little bit harder to work with. Now, I am no expert when it comes to making ceramics or working with clay, but I do know that conditioning the clay is an important step. So I go back and forth, wedging it with my hands and then rolling it out with a rolling pin. When rolling clay, I make sure to keep flipping it to get a more even slab. You can use depth guides as well, but I just winged it. I am not putting this bowl in a kiln or using it for any type of food purposes. This is purely decorative, so I wasn't too concerned about it being the same thickness all the way around. I brought Luna's bed into the craft room and she loves hanging out in here with me, you guys. She has become my little shadow. Sometimes she does get a little bit wild though, especially when Big Brother Odin is around. Alright, once my slab is big enough, I grabbed a bowl from my kitchen that was the size I want my clay bowl to be, and I covered it with cling wrap. That way the clay doesn't suction to my glass bowl. I also added a tiny little bit of oil to the cling wrap. I really don't want this clay to stick. Now I can cover the bowl with my clay. You want the clay to be much larger than the bowl so you can get a smooth outcome without wrinkles in the clay. Then I just work the sides to shape it against the bowl form. I also used a rib tool. I got this in a very cheap clay kit from the craft store, but a credit card or something similar would work just as well. This is going to smooth out the surface, especially for my fingerprints or any bumpy areas. Once I was good with the bowl shape, I cut off that excess clay. But I didn't cut it right up against that bowl just yet. I'm going to flip the bowl over to cut right along the edge of it. At this point, the clay is still pretty wet and moldable, so I let it sit for a few hours to start drying. Now that the clay is a little bit more firm, I took the rib to it again. This time I dipped it in water to help smooth out those sides. And I did the inside as well now that I can get to it. You can see on the inside of the bowl, there's a line near the top. That's from the bowl I used as a form. Well, I got a little tear in my clay, so I decided to cut it down a little bit using that line as a guide. And then I smoothed out the rim with some water in my fingers. Next, I need to make the top decorative portion of the bowl. The best way I thought to do this was to grab some more clay, roll it out to make a 1-inch long rectangle, and shape it off of the bowl first. I cut slits in the clay at 1 inch apart, and I started to round the edges to separate the sides from each other. Now, the McGee & Co. inspiration piece looked like the decorative part was rounder, almost like it had little balls on top. I think I could have done this a little bit different and shaped individual balls and then added them onto the clay section, but I didn't think about that at the time while making this bowl, so mine turns out a little bit stiffer looking. Now I need to connect the two pieces together. When attaching clay pieces, you want to score and slip it. This scoring tool also came in that basic clay toolkit that I bought, but you can use anything to create little cuts in the clay. Then you want to add slip, which is just clay mixed with water. You do this on both pieces that you want to join together, and then you smooth out the seams until you can't tell that these were two separate pieces. Then just repeat this until the top rim of the bowl is attached, and since this is air dry clay, set it aside to dry. Now this bowl will not be able to hold water and is not food safe, it is purely decorative. Here's how the bowl is looking once it's dried. There is a little crack on the section that I had to attach separately, and the clay is just a little bit uneven in spots. So I used a 120 grit sandpaper to smooth it out. I also wanted to clean up all of those slits because the clay dried a little uneven there. Of course, I got a little bit too rough and I broke a section off while sanding, right where that crack was. I was able to glue it back on using some super glue, and then I added some slip to fill in the cracks. And that's it for this piece. I sanded the slip area once it had dried, and I just left the bowl in its natural color like the McGee & Co. inspiration. But you could certainly paint something like this as well. A large vessel, and I don't love the straw-like material that's wrapped around the top of it. It's also broken in an area, so I'm gonna remove this. I was able to easily cut through it with a utility knife and start peeling it off. Most of the straw came off with the help of a multi-tool to scrape it. However, there are some areas where the adhesive was pretty strong and I wasn't able to get everything off. I needed to break down the adhesive in order to get all that residue off. So to do this, I got out my goof off and a microfiber towel. I soaked the towel in the goof off and let that sit for a few minutes to break down the glue. I always forget to move my camera arm when I do shots like this. That's that little black thing that's hanging down and keeps covering my head. If you haven't heard of Olive Atelier yet, it is a new retailer that is changing up the way people shop. The owners hand-source their products from countries around the world to find authentic, aged, and vintage items. They're located near Los Angeles, and they only open to the public 1 day a week. They also don't sell online, so unless you live in that area or take a trip out there, you cannot get your hands on these pieces. They have created such a cult following and high demand for their unique items, so since I live literally on the opposite side of the country, I've decided to try and dupe a few for myself. Okay, back to the projects at hand. The goof off has had some time to soak in and break down that glue. I was able to scrape it away much easier now. Eventually I did get out a razor blade, which worked a little bit better than the multi-tool, but I had to work my way around section by section, letting it soak and then scrape it off. If you need to do something like this, make sure you work in a well-ventilated room. I had all of my doors and windows open. Olive Atelier one I was inspired by had these decorative twists all around it. So I thought my 4mm macrame cord would give that same look. I used hot glue and added about 6 pieces on, going all the way down. Next, I'm going to paint the surface, and I want there to be texture to it, just like the old world vessels of my inspiration. A few months ago, I did a lime wash wall in my kitchen, and I made my own lime wash paint. I'm using what I have left as my base coat, which is going to add a very natural looking texture to the vessel. I started out using a sponge brush, but I actually really don't like working with these sponges at all. Every time I think I'll give it another shot, I regret it. I kept going with this first layer, but ditched the sponge brush for the second. Anyways, I was applying the lime wash in almost a stippling motion at first, but again, I wasn't loving that. So after I got the whole thing covered, I went back over and kind of smoothed it out. I didn't want to lose the texture and pattern, so I did this unevenly and in crosshatch motions. And now this guy needs to dry. Lime wash paint dries about 90% lighter than how it goes on, and I thought it was a little bit too light. So I got out my natural pigment and added in some more color to it using natural umber. This time I'm also using a chippy brush to apply it, and I prefer this one any day over the sponge brush. It also gives more texture. I continued with that crosshatch pattern to apply the lime wash all over the vessel. All right, while I love the rope that I added on the macrame because you can see that twist, which is really what the inspiration piece had. It was a lot larger, but you could really see that detail of the twisted look on the Olive Atelier pieces. So I have this Prima, redesigned by Prima mold here. and it has a similar like twist piece, or I could do a couple of different ones, but I think that's what I'm gonna go with. And I think I wanna add that on. It's gonna be a little bit bigger for the size of vessel that we have here. And I think because once I added paint, the like lime wash paint over top, and we still have more work to do in making this look more aged, this is just gonna show up a lot better because the twist is kind of starting to fade in some areas as the paint is building up on top of it. So I think that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna take these off. I just hot glued them on. Hopefully it's easy to just take them off, remove them. We are going to use some air dry clay and a mold, reapply it. We're gonna have to let that dry, unfortunately, and then go from there. May off the vessel, smoothed out where the hot glue was, and now I need to make all of the air dry clay twist pieces to add on. I'm using my DAS air dry clay. I really like this brand. Sculpey is another really good option, and then this redesigned by Prima silicone mold. You always want to dust a mold with cornstarch before adding in the clay so it doesn't stick and you get a clean design. These molds are a little different from the IOD ones I like to use since they do not have that micro rim, which allows you to easily remove any excess clay. So for molds like this, I take a palette knife or something like it and run it along the top of the mold to remove the clay. I didn't get a great clip of how I was adding these pieces on, but I cut each end at an angle, and that way it was a little easier to connect them together. Then I used my Titebond glue to attach them to the vessel. I added them on wet, otherwise they would have dried flat. There was some slight shrinkage while the clay dried, but I was able to fill that in with a tiny bit of spackle, and you can't even tell. My clay has dried. You can't even tell where I added in some spackle to fill in any gaps. Now I need to paint the clay sections with the lime wash paint so it all has that same color. This was actually pretty difficult. The lime wash did not want to get into all of the clay dents and divots. I kept trying different style paintbrushes to get it on. So when you use lime wash paint, each layer you apply slightly changes the color and also the texture of the surface. Since I was getting this layer of the lime wash on the sections that were already painted as well, I went back over the whole thing randomly applying the lime wash so you wouldn't see those stripe sections around the clay where it was a little bit darker. I don't think this part mattered because we're gonna cover up the whole thing again anyways. However, you could also stop here, and I think it looks beautiful just as it is. It was just too gray for me and didn't have enough age to it, so I went on to the next step. I'm using some acrylic paints and a sponge to layer on and get more of that aged patina. The first color I'm using is Cinnamon by Folk Art. The Olive Atelier pieces I was referencing had a terracotta looking base with some light aged areas on top. Another feature of lime wash is when it gets wet, the paint is reactivated. At first I was trying to avoid this and not wet my sponge too much, but I actually really liked how the areas were looking where I had wet the sponge a little bit more. Making anything look aged is a trust the process type of project, but projects like this usually always look kind of crazy and like a hot mess before they look good. There were plenty of times where I was seriously questioning what I was doing and I thought I had ruined the vessel. But I kept going, kept layering on the paint until I was happy with how it looked. It was difficult to get the sponge into all of the little crevices of the clay section, so I would use a detail brush or a chippy brush to apply the paint where needed. As I moved down the vessel, I started to add in some darker areas using Nutmeg and Burnt Umber by Apple Barrel. This started to add more depth to the piece. And again, that lime wash base layer helps to add some really interesting effects to the paint as it all dries. You could stop here as well, and this version is also beautiful and looks like aged terracotta, but it was a little bit too orange for me. So I decided to add in some more light tan over top. It really doesn't look tan as it dries, it's starting to look more gray, but I think this helps tone it down and bring it a little bit closer to my inspiration. I kept going back and forth with the darker and the lighter colors in hopes that it all melts together and look a little less splotchy than the previous version. While I liked how aged it looked, it was a little bit too busy. However, I didn't want any area to look too solid of one color, so I also took my sponge with the brown colors and very lightly dabbed it over here and there just to tie everything together. Now, you guys have to tell me which version you prefer, but let's take a look at how all 3 projects turned out. Even though I was really questioning how this would turn out, I'm so glad I kept on going with it. It is stunning and really gives that old world and aged vibe. You can style this simply like I have here with just an olive branch, or add in some pampas grass for even more of that boho look.
I'm taking 2 frames that I got from Habitat for Humanity for $5, and I'm just going to remove the canvas part. These are really large frames. They're about 17 by 14 inches, and I'm going to turn them into like a frame with a shelf. As I was taking off the canvas, I realized how glued on those edges were. They were seriously on there and not going anywhere. I tried sanding them off. I tried using Goo Gone. I tried everything to get them off, but they weren't budging. So in the end, I just painted over them, and you can't really tell. So next I just took some spackling and filled in the staple holes and the corners, and I paint the frame black. Next I'm taking some scrap wood from my garage, and I cut this down to fit perfectly inside of the frame, so it's about a little less than 14 inches maybe, and I just stain it with my antique Waverly wax. This was the easiest project. It seriously took me like maybe less than an hour with dry time and everything. It was so quick. So then I just took some wood glue, put it on the edge of the board where it's going to meet the frame, and took the brad nailer and added 2 nails to hold it in place while everything dries. This is the only project in this video that's not technically a plant vessel, but you could definitely use the shelf to put a plant on. I still wanted to include it since it is a look for less. And that's it. Don't you just love when something comes out level on the first try? So here's the inspiration piece. It was from Etsy for $130, and mine cost $5 for the frames. I made this and decorated it well before Christmas. So it was decorated for the holidays at this time, but you could certainly use this for any season and keep it up all year long. All right, so this last DIY was a complete fail. But I wanted to keep it in here because I wanted to show you what I did wrong, and I know how I could have fixed it. So I'm taking these various size dowel rods that come in a pack from Walmart. They come in a variety pack of like thicker, thinner, there's like square and circle ones. I only use the circle ones, but in varying thicknesses, and I'm spray painting them with a hammered black spray paint because I want this to have a metal look. This is where I went wrong. I should have glued everything together first before spray painting it, because of course the glue didn't stick whatsoever to the paint. But next I'm taking all of my dried dowel rods, and I'm placing out all of my vertical pieces first. So I got this inspiration from Wayfair. You'll see that here in a couple minutes, but it was like a metal art piece. It was just called metal home decor or metal wall decor on the website, but it was just like very modern and minimal looking, and it was just horizontal and vertical lines, varying thicknesses of metal. So here you can see I have all my vertical ones laid out there, and then I took my horizontal pieces and I started gluing them. So I realized I'm using hot glue, which obviously is not going to give a strong hold to begin with, but I also did go back in when I realized this wasn't working, and I used my CA glue because that's a super glue that is really strong with the accelerator. Again, that didn't work. It literally just crumbled as soon as I picked it up and went to hang it on my wall. So I did pick it up once to take outside. I wanted to give it one more last coat of spray paint, make sure everything was nice and covered. And then when I picked it up from the garage to bring inside, that's when it completely fell apart. So I do think this would have turned out great though, had I glued it all together before spray painting it. I also would have saved myself a lot of spray paint. painting those dowels individually was it was a lot of work, and it took a lot of paint. So here was the inspiration piece. It was $100. Mine would have cost $10 had it turned out, but I'm gonna show you here how it just fell apart on me. So I tried to put it all back together. It just wasn't working. I do think I'm gonna try to redo this because I wanted to put it in my bedroom above my headboard. So I think I'm gonna redo it and try to glue everything together first before I paint anything. But I just wanted to show you that not all DIYs turn out the way we want them to.